You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast.
All season long on the podcast, we celebrated the 1984 Cubs season. It was the 40th anniversary of the 1984 Cubs season. We celebrated it by going week by week. Every single episode of the podcast, we would parachute in, recap what happened that week in 1984, and here for your off-season enjoyment, here is a supercut of every single one of those 1984 segments put together in order so you can relive the 1984 season. Enjoy.
I will tell you that 40 years ago today, the Cubs were sucking in spring training. They were not winning any games, just so if that's any relief. And next week would be the anniversary, the 40-year anniversary of the retirement of Cub pitcher Fergie Jenkins, who called it a career. Just before if he had only known, right, what would become eventful 1984 season, when the Cubs, after were in the midst of a very hot 7-20 spring training record, including losing 15 games in a row and having not one but two fights amongst their own players, including Mel Hall and Dick Ruthven, seemingly in disarray. Cubs made a trade with the Philadelphia Phillies 40 years ago yesterday. They traded a fairly good, I think, setup reliever by the name of Bill Campbell. Soup, we called him. He had been like fireman of the year with the Red Sox, I think. He just passed away this last offseason, but he was a good relief pitcher. But they had Lee Smith and others Tim Stoddard, who they were relying on in the bullpen. And they traded him to the Philadelphia Phillies in exchange for a couple guys who you may have heard of. One was named Gary Matthews, and the other was Bobby Dernier, who then immediately became the Cubs' left fielder, Gary Matthews, Sarge, and Bobby Dernier became the center fielder and became the first half of what Harry Carey would later dub the Daily Double, with because gambling's always been part of baseball and sports. The Daily Double with Bobby Dernier and Ryan Sandberg at the top of the order. So the Cubs filled 2 of their 8 position spots, believe it or not, on March 26th of the offseason. So nothing like waiting till the last minute. There was no Scott Boras or Jordan Montgomery back then, but it did happen that players would be moved late in the game. And that kind of catapulted the Cubs, little did we know at the time, into a fairly competitive team. On this day in 1984, do you know what the Cubs record was?
I don't. What was the Cubs record?
0-0, because back in the normal days, they didn't start playing in March. They waited until April. So tomorrow actually would be opening day for the Cubs. And we'll get into what happened then thereafter. I will just note that as someone who prided himself on having quite good attendance all throughout school, I did miss opening day 1984 due to a sudden cough.
Sure.
We're playing at San Francisco, playing the Giants, and Huey Lewis and the News sang the national anthem. That's when I knew the Cubs were big time.
That's big time there.
The opening day rotation, and this will make more sense in the coming weeks and months when we talk about this, but the opening rotation for the Cubs to start the 1984 season was, for the first series, was Dick Ruthven, Chuck Rainey, and Scott Sanderson. Not exactly the rotation they ended the year with, but
not quite. It seems like you could improve upon that.
Yeah, and improvements they did make. We talked last week quickly about how they obtained Bobby Dernier and Gary Matthews like March 27th, which was a great time to do it. And so they were improving the team, but I don't think anyone had great expectations going into the season that rotation of Ruthven, Rainey, and Sanderson were the foundation of a 94 win team. Things improved as time went on. But yeah, we were sitting here anxiously awaiting the beginning of the season. Well, let me tell you about the 84 starting rotation. First off, it was a 4-man rotation, not a 5-man, not a 6-man, but a 4-man rotation. That rotation consisted of Dick Ruthven, Chuck Rainey, Scott Sanderson, and Steve Trout. Mike Trout was not born yet. Steve Trout. And the four guys kind of came to the Cubs in interesting fashion. Sanderson had been acquired that offseason, and the other three pitchers had been acquired the year before. So they were all either in the first or just starting their second year with the Cubs. Dick Ruthven was the ace of that team. He was the opening day starting pitcher. He had pitched for quite a few years with the Philadelphia Phillies. He was a veteran. He pitched on the World Series team where they won the World Series in 1980. So he was kind of brought the gravitas. However, his performance over the last several years had not been necessarily meeting those expectations. He was no John Lester, let's put it that way. He was a barely average starting pitcher at that point in time. And the Cubs had traded for him in May of the previous season to the Phillies and had given up. You remember Dallas Green was calling the shots for the Cubs, and he had come from the Phillies organization, so there was a lot of trading back and forth. The Cubs had flipped a relief pitcher, a very mediocre, middling relief pitcher named Willie Hernandez to the Phillies here in 1983 in May to acquire Ruthven, who would then be the ace starter to start the 84 season. The Phillies then flipped Hernandez to the Detroit Tigers, where in that very same 1984 season, Willie Hernandez became the first player, I think, ever to win the Cy Young and MVP as a closer in the same season. So would have been good to have him on the Cubs probably that year with his 192 ERA, his 80 relief appearances and 140 innings pitched. Back then, relief pitchers really put in the work. But the Cubs did not. They had ace starter Dick Ruthven. The number 2 starting pitcher in that rotation, Chuck Rainey, who they had acquired a year before in exchange for Doug Bird. Doug Bird, you might remember, was who they had obtained when they traded Rick Russell and broke the hearts of many young child in Chicago a couple years before then. But Chuck Rainey was most famous on this podcast, as you know, for having thrown a near no-hitter broken up by stupid Eddie Milner with that base hit with 2 outs in the 9th inning when the Cubs were playing the Reds, ruining a perfect father-son moment with my dad and I watching it on WGN television after school one day. But that's a whole other story. One of our fans was so kind as to send me an autograph ball with Eddie Milner's autograph on it, which I still have on the wall here, just to look at whenever I really want to get fired up about something. But that was Chuck Rainey's high point. He was not a very good pitcher. Had never been a very good pitcher, but he was the Cubs' number 2 starter that season. I would liken him to someone worse than anyone in the rotation today. So if you want to, I'm trying to think of what the parallel would be with him, but I can't come up with one. Sorry. Not as good as Jameson Taillon. How about that? Not even at that level. Not even close.
He was his generation's Chris Volstad.
Yes. Chris Volstad. Nice. Perfect comparison. The number 3 starter, who the Cubs had acquired that offseason, was Scott Sanderson. Now, Scott Sanderson had some good seasons with the Expos. In fact, I knew of Scott Sanderson. He had been an all-star one year. He was definitely considered a pretty good pitcher. He had a kind of an off year the year before, which is probably how the Cubs got him. But they acquired him in a 3-way deal with San Diego, where the Cubs gave up promising young outfielder Carmelo Martinez, along with Craig Lefferts, who was a relief pitcher, sometimes swing starter, but had a couple good years, was young too himself. But the Cubs were, definitely wanted. I can imagine Dallas Green looked at their rotation and thought, oh my God, I got to get something here. Looked at it and thought, Scott Sanderson as a number 3 would be pretty good. And that was at the time, I think, what you would consider to be a good number 3 starter if you had a 1 and a 2, which they did not. And then rounding out the 4-man rotation was none other than Steve Trout, friend of the show. We may have on, I think, at some point this season. We'll see. He had been acquired from the Chicago White Sox in a blockbuster trade, along with Warren Brewstar, Cub bullpen man, in exchange for a host of Cub players. The most famous of which was Dick Tidrow. They called him Dick Tidrow, who was the setup man for Bruce Sutter before the Cubs gave Bruce Sutter to the Cardinals for nothing a couple years before. But he had been a setup man for the Cubs for several years. Good pitcher, tough guy, mustache, the whole thing. Whole works. The whole early 80s, Sparky Lyle type of feel to him. So that was a loss, losing your setup man like that, especially when you gave up Lefferts as well. But the Cubs also gave up a host of what I would call, if you look at a Topps baseball card from that era, it'd be like top prospects. And it's Randy Martz and Pat Tabler and Scott Fletcher and a bunch of names that no one today remembers. But if you were a child at that time and you got that baseball card, you were waiting for those names to appear. No internet. You're waiting for the names on that baseball card to appear at a major league game. And when they did, sadly, they did not live up to the hype of future star or whatever it said on the card. So the Cubs gave up a bunch of spare parts. It was obvious that Dallas Green was trying to clean house a little bit and get rid of some from what had been a notoriously poor farm system. The people who did matriculate to the majors and played fairly mediocre baseball. So they got rid of those three guys. And so that's what we had. That was the 4-man rotation heading into the season. And so when you look at today's starting rotation, it feels like it's a little bit in tatters. It's not really clear yet. Just know that it was much worse to start 84. That was not a 96 win team starting rotation. We left off last week with the Cubs' first week on the West Coast. They finished up that West Coast trip by dropping the first 2 games to the Dodgers in week 2, but still a 3-4 West Coast trip, which, trust me, back then was considered a success.
Oh, sure.
The Cubs came home for home opener, April 13th, back in the days when, it was a gentleman's schedule where they didn't start in March. They started the second week of April. So April 13th was the home opener for the Cubs. And the home opener was against a team called the New York Mets. Now, in 1983, just 1 year before, when the Cubs had finished 71-91 en route to a 5th place finish in the NL East, which was the division at the time, the New York Mets were able to one-up the Cubs by finishing 68-94 and finishing in dead last. So this was a matchup of the 2 worst teams from the previous year. And for those of you who aren't familiar with, and nor should you be, I guess, National League alignment in the 1980s, do you know who the 6 teams in the National League East were back then?
I do.
Yes. Give me throw me one, Jeremy. We'll go every other one here.
Pittsburgh
Pirates, correct. Michael?
Montreal
Expos. Jeremy?
Atlanta.
No. They were in the West, of course. Playing with the Dodgers and the Giants. I mean, why wouldn't they be?
St. Louis.
And then the last team was the Philadelphia Phillies, who had won the division in 1983. So in 83, the division went Phillies, Pirates, Expos, Cardinals, Cubs, Mets. And so now here in 1984 for the home opener, the Cubs, before a crowd of 33,434 fans on a glorious Friday afternoon, went up against the Mets and their rookie pitcher. They had a rookie pitcher on that team. His name was Dwight Gooden. Wasn't Doc Gooden yet. He was still Dwight Gooden. And we'll often talk about how the Cubs famously Tuffy Rhodes hit 3 home runs on opening day off of Dwight Gooden. That was in 1994. In 1984, the Cubs hit 3 home runs off of Dwight Gooden also. So Wrigley Field was not a place he liked to start his season. But in 1984, the home runs were hit by Ron the Penguin Say, who the Cubs had acquired from the Dodgers in the offseason, Jody Davis, the Cubs catcher, stalwart of that team, and Gary Sarge Matthews, who they had acquired like 2 weeks before in a late spring training trade. So they hit the 3 homers off of Gooden. And unlike the 94 game, in the 84 game, the Cubs won 11-2. It was a great game. In fact, they knocked Gooden around quite a bit in that game. So that was a great way to start the season. The next game, just to give you a little flavor for what life was like for the Cubs back in 1984, Game 2, Saturday afternoon, 4-4 off a big win the day before. Cubs played in front of 15,789 fans on a Saturday. And Dick Ruthin, who was the ace pitcher to start the season, propelled the Cubs to another victory. The Cubs won 5-2 in that second game, so they beat the Mets 2 in a row. What's interesting is the third game, and at the time, people thought little of this. It was on a Sunday. The game was rained out, and it was scheduled to be made up as part of an August 7th doubleheader. Please believe me when I tell you, audience, no one was thinking at that moment when the doubleheader was announced that the August 7th, 1984 doubleheader with the Mets would have any significance to anyone at all. And yet, and we will get to this in August of this year, it would have a huge significance, that series. But at the time, it was just, and this is the beauty of having the imbalanced schedules where you played your own division most of the time, right? The Mets were going to come to town a couple times and we're going to go there. So no need to play a game in 12-degree temperatures back then. You would just schedule a doubleheader. That's what people did. So the Cubs on that day had a rain out. They then had the Monday off. The following Tuesday, they were due to play the St. Louis Cardinals. Cubs riding high on a at that time 5-4 record, and that game was snowed out. So the Cubs did not play that game either. Instead, they scheduled a doubleheader for the following day, Wednesday, which we'll get to next week because we've now run out of the week. So here we are. Cubs have not played a game now for 3 consecutive days, which is great when you have a 4-man rotation because it makes it a lot easier to manage your pitchers. But the Cubs had a very successful finish to the week, a 2-2 week overall. I will just note that the drainage was not as good back then as it is. Remember when the Cubs, even before they redid the stadium, I want to say it was probably like 20 years ago. Remember they hired the guy from the White Sox and they actually leveled the playing field, literally, because before he was a crown stadium,
Yep.
so you couldn't see first base from third. Like if you were in the Cubs dugout, you could not see first base. So when they would scream and yell about calls at first, they were just kind of going off instinct at that point. But they put a real a more modern drainage system into the ballpark that would help rain go, because back in the 80s when it rained, the rain sat there. I mean, there was nowhere for it to go. So that may have contributed to the plight of the Cubs in April of 1984. But much to talk about in future weeks, but that's where we were on this day in 1984.
Do you mind if I add a little bit of flavor?
Please.
You may, for sure.
So that win against Dwight Gooden in 1984, you might think that, the Cubs are going to have this guy's number for the rest of his career.
It will 10 years later in one game.
Dwight Gooden, despite the fact that he is remembered as a guy who gives up a lot of home runs against the Cubs, is maybe the ultimate Cubs killer of all time. If you seriously look up his record against the Cubs, it's like 28-1 or something ridiculous. And that 1 or 2 losses that he had was in 1983 when he was making like his second start in the majors. He won like 26 consecutive games against the Cubs. They basically didn't beat him for the rest of the 80s.
Wild.
The absolute, and it was like with a 1 point something ERA. He was basically prime Jake Arrieta against the Cubs for like a decade.
But we were in week 3. The Cubs had a West Coast trip to start the season. They had come home. They'd been battling a lot of rainouts, and they managed, I think last time we talked, they just had another rainout. So they played, after being off like 3 days in a row, a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, they played a doubleheader against the Cardinals on Wednesday, and then they played a game on Thursday. And then they had a 3-game set against the Pirates, all at home. So this was an opportunity for the Cubs to sort of set themselves apart from the rest of the division. They managed, thankfully, to take 2 out of 3 from the Cardinals. Sadly, they split the doubleheader, as often happens. Joaquin Andujar was the starter for the Cardinals. Some people might remember him. He was a good pitcher. But then Scott Sanderson won the nightcap. Cubs turned around and Steve Trout won the next game. Interesting in those days on the Wednesday game. So back then when they played doubleheaders, it wasn't this play a day game, clear the stadium, play a night game. It was first games at noon, second games at 3. And so they would play back to back and you could come for both games. And on that Wednesday, we had 5,800 fans who decided to come out for one of the 2 games, if not both of them. Kind of that's one of those close the upper deck days, which they used to do back in the old days. We were about a month and a half away from that never happening again. But at this point in time, that was standard operating procedure at Wrigley Field on a weekday, which is not having the upper deck open. So just to put some things in a little bit of perspective from today's day, it was almost like, we might see the White Sox, for example, end up having to close the upper deck this year at some point, if not for the rest of the year. They then went into the weekend against the Pirates, where they managed to win 1 out of 2 games against the Pirates. The third game, of course, was a Sunday game that got, wait for it, rained out. Yet another rain out in the season. I'm going to highlight today the Friday game played in front of 22,000 fans, because that was a game where the Cubs were tied, and they fell behind. They tied it up. They went into extra innings in that game, and it was in the 10th inning. The Cubs won the game in a walk-off, 5-4. And what was interesting about that, first of all, the Pirates had their ace closer in the game, Kent Tekulve. I don't know if you ever remember. He's that submarine pitcher. He weighed about 108 pounds, and he was super skinny, and he would whip the ball like underhand to home plate, which they don't teach anymore. I think I can only imagine when those 3D machines trying to like look at his actual pitching and try to figure out like what he needs to do right in order to get his mechanics fixed. They would the machine would break if they saw Kent Tekulve ever pitch. It was very effective. The game in the 10th inning, bottom of the 10th, they had no ghost runners back then, of course, either. Cubs led off with a triple by red hot Ryan Sandberg, who just had moved over to second base that season after playing 1 year at third base in his sophomore campaign. They had a couple of walks, and then a guy by the name of Mel Hall walked it off at the base hit. The reason I highlight that game in Mel Hall is that Mel Hall had come up the previous year. He was a top prospect for the Cubs. Like, he was the deal, the real deal. And there was a lot of hope for him. But very sort of strangely, the Cubs had made this trade, as we talked about in previous podcasts, at the end of March, third to last day of spring training, where they brought in Gary Matthews, Sarge, and Bob Dernier to play left field and center field respectively. And this caused a lot of upheaval in the lineup, because while Jody Davis was the catcher, Sandberg was at second, Boa was the shortstop, and Ron Say, the Penguin, was at third. The Cubs found themselves in this awkward position of having like five guys to play between right field / or maybe even left field, depending on Matthews, and first base. They had Bill Buckner, who'd been the first baseman for years, Leon Durham, who was the up-and-coming first baseman on this team. They had Keith Moreland, who they had a lot of hope for, and they had Mel Hall. So they had like just a plethora of players. And they had been trying all through April to juggle all these guys in the lineup. And it reminds me a little bit of this Cubs team, and this is why I bring it up. It was a combination of veteran players like a Buckner, who had, been through a lot and had won the batting crown and was like a proven guy, but was, on the other side of 30 at this time. You had the Michael Bush types like Leon Durham, who was the next big thing. And then you had these young guys like Mel Hall and Keith Moreland, who, you had high hopes for, but collectively had just a couple hundred at bats total. And so the question was going to be like, how do you juggle this? How do you play these guys? What do you do with Gary Matthews? He's an older player, but he's playing well. He's your Ian Happ, basically, in the lineup, right? And so it was going to be very interesting to see how they would manage this. It didn't help that they had a rain out pretty much every other day so far in the season at the point that we're at. And so in the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about how they sort of started making some trades and making some moves, and how they kind of opened up the roster a little bit in ways that inured to their benefit, because the one thing they were kind of shy on was they could use a little help with the starting pitching. And sure enough, that would be coming. So the Cubs are 8-5. It was one of the best starts they'd had in 20 years. So, all was well in Wrigleyville at this point, but there were some discontent festering in the clubhouse from some players who wanted more playing time. My dad, coincidentally, your uncle, not coincidentally actually, but by law, found something when he was digging through the garage or something at my parents' house and gave it to me on Friday. It is it's now been laminated, but it was a poster that I had on my wall in my bedroom as a kid. After the 1984 season, it was made by the paper company that our grandfather worked for. And that's where I acquired it from.
Pat is holding it up. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can see what he's showing us.
It's actually pretty cool. It goes month by month. It goes game by game. It goes month by month with the standings. And then there are things in the corner that are significant, like Miracle in Wrigley Field, Cubs clinch, September 24th, 1984. Spoiler alert on that one. Yes. And it has the lineup, the playoff lineup all the way around, the manager, the roster, along with all of the championship seasons, sans for 2016, which had not occurred yet.
Very cool.
Top. So
that is a very cool poster.
And looking at this, it reminds me. So if we go back 40 years ago to this very week, what we saw was the Cubs winning. Let's see, it was 2 out of 3 from the St. Louis Cardinals, and then on the road, and then they won 2 out of 3 at Pittsburgh, including a 2-hitter by Scott Sanderson. Always like to see those. It doesn't list back then how many pitches were thrown, but I'm guessing it was probably like 88 or so from the looks of it. It wasn't a lot. Not a lot of walks, not a lot of strikeouts, not a lot of hits, obviously. Just kind of, old school, right? So the Cubs finished a 4-2 road trip. Steve Trout and Scott Sanderson, 2 of the starting pitchers in the rotation, were on fire. And looking at my calendar from that year through April 30th, and we'll flash forward to the end of the month, since by the time this airs, it'll be the end of the month. The Cubs had accumulated a tie for first place record. They're tied with the Mets, half a game ahead of the Phillies, with a record of 12-8, which was, by Cubs standards back in those days, that was really good. They were 12-8 to start the season. Juxtapose that to this year, where the Cubs will have played 30 games by the end of April. They had played but 20 back then, because the season was a little bit more backloaded, and there were double headers and things like that. So the Cubs were off to a good start. They were 12-8. Ryan Sandberg, that second-year player who had moved over to second base, was en route to commit the same number of errors as Nico Horner has so far this year, but Sandberg did it in the entire season. Horner's on pace, by the way, with his 5th error today, for 30-plus errors this year. That seems like a lot, which is a whole other point about the Cubs' middle infield defenses here. But we can save that for another
day. Defensive podcast. Yes, that's another podcast.
But in 1984, Ryan Sandberg was doing quite well, and I was just sort of perusing through some of the stats. Catcher Jody Davis, Gary Matthews, the new left fielder they'd acquired from the Phillies at the end of March, all doing well. Leon Durham was getting a lot more appearances at first base, which was, for many of us who were fans of Bill Buckner, one of the greatest Cubs of all time, a bit unsettling, but Durham was doing well. All things where systems go with this patchwork 4-man rotation, plenty of rainouts and a lot of hodgepodge in between. But Lee Smith, the closer, had now amassed 5 saves in his new role as permanent closer. And Cubs had a couple pitchers that were looking good. So they were 12-8, tied for first place with the Mets team, who, as we had talked about previously, had finished – the Mets had finished in last place the year before, and the Cubs had finished in second to last. So the division had been turned topsy-turvy, and the only question was, how long would this last? So that's where we were at the end of April 1984. And if you don't believe me, it's right here on the calendar. A ho-hum week for the Cubs. They were 2-3. They dropped 2 at New York at the cruddy old Shea Stadium.
The worst stadium in history. I have so many horrendous stories about that place.
They lost to Dwight Gooden, who they had beaten on opening day. So he got his revenge, Mr. Rookie of the Year wannabe. And then they came home and they played the Padres, the mediocre San Diego Padres of April and May. And the Cubs took 2 out of 3. They lost the first one, but they came back in dramatic fashion with 2 walk-off wins. In the 9th inning, Keith Moreland had a walk-off walk to score Ryan Sandberg. The Cubs won the game. Then the very next day, off of Craig Lefferts, former Cub pitcher, Ron Say slashed a bases-loaded base hit into left field, scoring Ryan Sandberg. There was a pattern developing.
There's a theme to these
involving
wins,
Ryan Sandberg.
Yeah.
And the Cubs won that. So Lee Smith had blown a game in New York on a walk-off that they had lost, and then he came back and got the win in this one. So 2-3 week, penetrating water. But today I thought I'd do something a little bit different than just talk about what happened that week, because it was, it was a week, whatever. They only played 5 games because they had 2 off days that week. A lot of off days back then, considering they didn't start the season till
and they say people don't want to work anymore.
Right.
They didn't, they didn't
a
work.
A lot of working at home back then, apparently.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
So I have an original source document that I found in my storage unit in my building. It's the volume 3 of the Chicago Cubs 1984 official souvenir program magazine. And I'm not going to go through.
Pat is showing it on camera. If you are watching our YouTube feed, which you should be doing, you should subscribe to the YouTube channel, Wrigleyville Nation Podcast. Search for it on YouTube. You can see what Pat's holding up right now. Tell us more about it, Pat.
Well, this is Larry Bowa and Ryan Sandberg on the cover, the double play combination. And Larry Bowa was a 13-year vet, and Sandberg was the second-year second baseman who'd won a Gold Glove the year before, by the way. I'm not going to go through the entire magazine today because it is so rich with detail, but I am going to go through several of things I found in it because I think it's a good reminder of what 1984 was like, both in Cubs fandom, but also in city of Chicago fandom. And I think, the spirit and the essence of what 1984, how retrograde it really was, needs to be brought to light to better understand what was happening. So I'm going to read you a 2-paragraph letter from Dallas Green, Cubs GM, to the fans. Ready?
To the fans.
Jeff Hoyer should listen in on this one. Right?
Yeah, we don't get these letters much anymore, I don't feel like.
Dear fans, as we begin our third year together, it's time for you to start seeing some progress. See?
Whoa.
Only 3 years? Wow.
And hopefully our 1984 season will give you just that. For the first time, I feel that our farm system is ready to help and give us some interesting young talent. Our offense is capable, and our defense can be very good. The pitching staff has improved and must stand the test of pressure. We have new field leadership, i.e. Jim Fry, taking over for Lee Healy, and I feel we should be able to compete and have a fun summer. So, okay, thanks, Dallas. So moving forward here, we then have the Let Us Entertain You crossword puzzle. Every Let Us Entertain You restaurant that has since closed, Lawrence of Oregano and
Lawrence of Oregano was the name.
and-
Oh my God, that is what a Spinal Tap ass name that is. That is insane. I didn't know Let Us Entertain You had been around that long.
No,
That's
yeah, no idea.
incredible.
Bones from Lincolnwood, Rupert's Ribs and Chop House, Gino's East. Apparently these don't Gino's East. I didn't realize that. Anyway, other than RJ Grunt's, every other restaurant no longer here, but it is a fun little crossword puzzle that you can do if you want to. And then you move to the meat of the thing, which is this actually, I have to say, it was a really interesting article on Bowa and Sandberg. And it kind of walks through like their relationship, and they interviewed both of them, and they talk about, how much Sandberg learned from Bowa, and Bowa explained how much he had taught Sandberg.
So they agreed.
Yes, they agreed. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, look, I told him, I said, look, I need you to always put the ball in the same place on the double plays. They threw shade on the Bump Wills, who'd been the second baseman in 82. They're like, yeah, we only had 47 double plays when that guy was here, but last year he had over 100. So we're doing it right now.
Oh God, double plays under replacement from Bump.
Thanks, Bump.
Yeah.
My favorite part was this quote. They'd mentioned Manny Trio, who had been a Cubs second baseman who'd been traded to the Phillies for spare parts, and had been Larry Bowa's counterpart when they won the World Series in 1980 or something. So they said, and when you think of Ryan Sandberg, tell me if this is what you think of. Quote, just like Manny Trio gets to a lot of ground balls, already people are calling Ryan Sandberg the Manny Trio of the 1980s.
People keep saying that. They still say it.
Even today.
Yeah.
Ryan Sandberg, the Manny Trio of the 1980s. He'll always be
I feel
remembered.
an obvious shirt coming on here.
Yeah.
Manny Trio of the 1980s on an obvious shirt would be like, oh man, how many lovely people you could confuse in the bleachers to be like, what's happening here? And if you know, you know.
There's also an article, and Dallas Green had mentioned this too later in his letter, but I'd stopped reading because the boring part was coming. But it's pressed for time here. We can only do the good stuff. So the Cubs had do you remember, Jeremy, you and I did this. I don't know if you've ever done this, Kevin. Before 2016, if you'd ever gone on a tour of Wrigley Field, they have those tours where they walk you through the clubhouse and stuff. Remember the old clubhouse? That's just the rat hole, old, small clubhouse.
Only saw on TV and stuff, but yeah.
Yeah, well, it was brand new. They had just built it.
The famously old. Yes.
Wow.
The clubhouse that we look at and say, oh my God, I can't believe they played here. Rick Russell, who was on the team, had long time vet, who later went on to play for another decade with the Pirates and the Giants, Big Daddy as they called him. The article says, Rick Russell knows the value of the new clubhouse. He spent 10 years as a Cub in the old one. Quote, there's no doubt this place is a heck of a lot nicer than the old one. It's nice to have some more room in here. In the other one, everybody kept bumping into each other when they'd have to lift weights and work out. He said, although it's not the reason why they got off to a hot start. He said, a winning attitude comes from the play on the field, but coming to a clubhouse like this every day is pretty damn nice. And the clubhouse is the size of my hotel room. I mean, it's ridiculously small.
Well, also that in the smaller, older place, they were lifting weights in that. Can we get a separate weight room? He's like, we're bumping into each other where it's like, yeah, you're doing curls over a toilet, my dude. Right, like we have to spread it out.
And they show the players can analyze the picture. It says, caption says, players can analyze their play on film. It's a projector screen with a projector and what looks to be an Apple IIe computer, I think. Apparently, they could do that. So that was the brand new clubhouse that everybody was talking about. They have a down on the farm report with a picture of Thad Bosley at age 19 and, stuff like that. But then there's another section here, and this is something I was unaware of. Maybe you two are. I don't know. Are you familiar with the 1984 Chicago Cubs spirit?
I mean, it's in my heart, I guess. But yeah,
it appears to be.
Was this an airline or a pack of cigarettes? What is the
10 women in their early to mid 20s who are Cubs ambassadors who would walk around the stadium being ambassadors? And they're probably your mom's age, Kevin, to be honest with you. It says here they walk around the stadium. She might know some of them. I don't know. It says social and community events attract greater crowds when the appearance of 2 or more Cubs spirit is promised. So there you go.
Well, it's nice to know the minimum number of the team that they are sending out on these assignments. This is one where, like, maybe we shouldn't investigate too much what was going on with the Cubs spirit at the time, but it seems fun.
So yeah, I had never heard of it. I never heard of it since. No. I got to talk to somebody who was around back then.
Yeah. God, if you're a member of the Cubs spirit, call in, please.
Yeah, please.
DM.
Do you know Jeannie Reed or Jody Sheehan or Nancy Benson or any of the Cubs spirit? Michelle Lee, if you're listening.
That's a good get. Get the spirit on here for the 40th. That would.
It lists their birthdays and years, what town they're from, and their occupation. So there you go.
All right, we'll be on the hunt to try to track them down.
And get a bleacher hang together with all the spirit. Let's go. Let's friggin' rage.
The next page, of course, is an ad for the Berghoff, which is still around.
Yeah.
Round trip coach to and from Wrigley Field, including lunch for all Cubs 305 weekday games. Now, the Berghoff, I looked this up because I had this in my memory somewhere. It had only been 15 years since they went co-ed. They didn't allow women into the Berghoff until 1969.
Wow.
So
pretty fresh. Yeah.
So we're in an era. We're just in a different era in 1984 here. But the final one I have to give you is the whole back page, of course, is an ad for Old Style, right? But not just Old Style. Because when you want a full-bodied beer, but you don't want all the calories of an Old Style, get an Old Style Light.
Yeah. Look at those pull tab cans. Look at those pull tab cans.
Pull tab can, for your drinking enjoyment.
Those tabs, that is very Juicy Juice used to be like that. I don't know if you guys remember Juicy Juice, but I remember as a child that was I would see that torn away.
You take them and you put them in the can.
Oh, tremendous. I don't know if I've ever seen an Old Style Light in my life. That used to be when I was going to Ball State University. That was the cheap beer, $9 for a 30-pack in the early 2000s. I think
Diet RC was in its heyday too at the time. So,
sure, yeah.
So that was the era. So that's all I'll go through today. There's more to get through, but that's all I could.
That's great.
So. Yeah, but that was Chicago and the Chicago Cubs in 1984 as the team was powering through with the surprising start to the season. There comes a time usually in a season where things happen that make you say, hey, this team might actually be real. We saw it in 2015. There were just these things in 2003. There are these seasons where expectations were not high, right? You haven't been winning recently. You don't have a track record of success. 1989, same thing, Boys of Zimmer, right? 1998. But there are these seasons where something happens where a string of things happens, and you start to say to yourself, this team might actually be better than I thought, or this team might actually be able to go somewhere. And although the Cubs only went 4-3 the week of May 7th to 13th back 40 years ago, we started to see some things happen that made you say, I think this team might actually be good. The Cubs that week had some interesting games. The first one being the May 7th game, they're up 10-0. The bullpen collapsed, gave up 7 runs, but then they held on and won 10-7. And it was one of those games where, if you were around in that era, you're like, well, boy, this is going to be embarrassing, losing a 10-0 lead and not winning the game, which is what you anticipated at that point. But it didn't happen. And Leon Durham in that game hit a home run in his 4th straight game, which was a big deal, young first baseman. The following day, they had an 8-2 lead early in the game. They blew the lead. The game was tied at 11, and you're like, well, here we go. And that was a game where we'd seen Ron Say get a grand slam, and the hitting was so good, but the pitching was collapsing. And then in the 10th inning, the Cubs got a walk-off base hit from Keith Moreland, Zonk, as we call him in the day, and they won the game 12-11. It was another one of these exciting kind of like comeback wins. The following day, Scott Sanderson pitched yet another gem. He and Rich Bordy had a 5-hit shutout, and the Cubs won that game 7-0. And then the very next day, on May 10th, the Cubs won 5-4 thanks to a 9th inning 3-run pinch hit home run from Jody Davis. And I guess what made these games even more special was that these games at the end of that stretch there were games against the Houston Astros being played in the Astrodome, which was not a place the Cubs were very successful at. That Jody Davis game was in the Astrodome, the 8th wonder of the world, as they called it at the time. And even though the home games the Cubs played, one of those home games they won on the 12-11 walk-off, which would have been a really fun game to go to. Wrigley attendance was 4,600 that day. So as we mock modern teams for their low attendance, just keep in mind that was once our fate. So the Cubs are really starting to win some games, get some dramatic wins. Last week we talked about a couple walk-off wins. We're starting to see a lot of late inning, extra inning, 9th inning wins. I just wanted to touch on, I brought another original source document today. Last week I had the program. This week I have the 1984 Cubs media guide.
Pat, where could people see the media guide you're holding up right now?
Yeah, it's and of course the McDonald's ad on the back, right?
You can see that on our YouTube channel. If
you
go
can.
to
That's right.
YouTube.com, search Wrigleyville Nation Podcast, give us a subscribe there, and you can see the cool things that Pat is showing on a couple weeks. You can go back to last week and see the program he had last week. And now go ahead and show us that again, Pat.
Yeah, here we go. Here's the 19. So the media guides, it's this thick. I used to get this every year. This was the one gift I would get at Wrigley for my, as a kid growing up, before kids got all the stuff they get now. We were entitled to one gift per season, and every year I would get the media guide. That was my. And one year I somehow got a team autograph, team photo, and a media guide. I don't know. My grandparents must have taken me to one of those games. But in any event, 3 things I want to note for the media guide. I haven't gone through it in great detail, but there are 3 things that kind of caught my interest that I thought were funny. One, there's the reference, facts about Wrigley Field. Do you know? One of the facts was Ernie Banks is the only Cub player to ever have his uniform retired by the Chicago Cubs, number 14. It's right there. And of course, we've had several since, and we're going to get another well-deserved one with Ryan Sandberg coming up in about a month. But that was just to remind us all of where we were back in those days. There's a long expose on the park, which had been in the Wrigley Field, which had been around at that point for 68 years. Jeremy, we were at the 100th year celebration. So just to put it in perspective. The other fun fact I saw is the president. So we knew Dallas Green was the executive vice president, general manager, right? And Jim Fry was the manager. Do you know who the president and chief executive officer was of the team back then? I had forgotten this fact.
No.
None other than Jim Finks, who had left the Chicago Bears to take this position. But he left the Chicago Bears having just drafted the best draft in the history of the NFL, which included like Otis Wilson and Richard Dent in like the 5th round and the 7th round, and just the McMahon and Covert and Thayer. I mean, the whole 85 Bears Super Bowl team, like a third of their star players or 2/3 of them were drafted in that draft. So based on that draft, and at the time, of course, nobody knew because it was heading into 1984. So the Cubs scooped him up, and the Bears went on to greatness. And he probably was looking back a little bit later thinking, maybe we should have stuck around the NFL. But that was a case of an NFL executive going to become a baseball executive. And the last thing I wanted to mention was I was looking at the broadcasters. There's a picture here of Steve Stone, a very young Steve Stone. He was in his 2nd year of broadcasting because he just retired in 1982 with the Cubs, having won the Cy Young in 1980 in an arm injury. And he joined the Cubs and was a broadcaster, a former Cub, right? Was a broadcaster. He was in year 2, partnered with this guy who was in his 3rd year as a Cubs broadcaster, a guy named Harry Carey, who had only, I think back, and obviously they had to start sometime, but I forgot that 84, they were basically almost a brand new team. They were in their infancy as a broadcasting pair. And of course they were broadcasters together forever. Then Milo Hamilton, whose guts I hate, or who I've never liked, was in his 8th season. He was the one who famously was upset that the Cubs had acquired Harry Carey and made him the play-by-play guy because Hamilton thought that he deserved to be the television play-by-play guy as opposed to radio, where he was sent off to. And he thought that was his job to lose. And when Jack Brickhouse retired, who was the play-by-play guy on WGN television, Milo was very upset. And keep in mind, back in those days, the Chicago Cubs television play-by-play jobs was one of the most sought-after jobs in America because the Cubs and the Braves were the 2 teams in all of baseball that had a superstation. So WGN was broadcast nationally on a lot of cable packages and over-air, and as were the Braves, and nobody else. All other television was local. There wasn't a lot of national TV. The only TV was there were 2 TV games. There were the Saturday afternoon games that were televised during the summer only, and then there was Monday Night Baseball, which was televised until football would start. So there were these small windows of national games. Everything else was local. So this was a big gig to get, and Harry Carey got it in his 3rd season, the Cubs' 1984 season.
What happened this week?
This was a good week for the 1984 Cubs. They went 5-1.
Wow.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice? They won 2 out of 3 at Cincinnati, and they came home and they swept the Houston Astros with a walk-off walk. We did a lot of walk-off walks back in the 80s. Another one, we've been talking about this all year, and yet another walk-off walk. This time Gary Woods walked in Leon Durham in the 9th inning, give the Cubs one of the wins against Houston, against future Cub relief pitcher Dave Smith. I don't know if you remember Dave Smith. He was with the Cubs, I think, for 1 year. He sucked, but he was a pretty good relief pitcher for the Astros before. I remember him most as a child in the late 80s, early 90s maybe, because I remember watching him smoke cigarettes in the bullpen, which, by the way, was just down the left field line, so you couldn't miss it. There was no wall. He just sat there and smoked cigarettes on the field, basically. And then he got smoked whenever he came into games, at least his Cub season. But he was doing pretty well with the Astros, except for the time when the Cubs got the walk-off walk. And so that 5-1 week catapulted the Cubs into first place in the NL East at the time, the 6-team NL East. And that was significant because this was a Cubs team that had not finished over 500 in a dozen years. And apart from the miraculous, glorious 1977 Cubs that were actually in first place in May, before having a June swoon of epic proportion, the Cubs hadn't really had this kind of success this late in the year in quite some time. So being in first place was a big deal. It was something that almost nobody predicted, but somebody did predict it. And I remember that. And I have a resource here, an original source. This is do you remember a guy by the name of Bill James?
Of course.
He's still on Twitter, but back in the 80s, he came out starting in 1984, I think, with this thing called the Bill James Baseball Abstract. right?
Wow, look at that.
And when I was a kid, I got these things. I have 84, 85, 86, 87, and 88. And what he was famous for at the time was it was the very cutting edge beginning of the sabermetrics movement. He kind of looked at things differently. He looked at stats differently. He started counting things like walks as opposed to just hits in terms of analyzing the value of players. He came up with, his own sort of like runs created calculus, formula that included, on base percentage and slugging percentage. Well, he didn't call it that, but basically, total bases, and then he would also divide it by plate appearances to show like how much value players. It was like an early WAR almost offensively, right? How much value players were performing at. So he had these books that he would come out with, and he would go through whatever new stats he was coming up with at the time, playing around with stuff, and then he would do his analysis of the teams team by team. So imagine my surprise as a young child when I got to the Chicago Cubs page, the 5th place Chicago Cubs from the year before, which was an upgrade from 6th place the year before that, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, I'll read you the Cubs section, the first sentence. If anybody offers you 100 odds against the Chicago Cubs winning the National League East in 1984, take them up on it. And then he goes on to say, if I've ever seen a dead giveaway set up for a miracle, this is it. And he predicted the Cubs would win the division. He said it wasn't a sure thing, but he said the odds should be like 6-1, which was ridiculous. 6-1. I mean, we're a 90-loss team. Why would we have such good odds to win? And he walked through factors that people back in 40 years ago didn't take into account. Like he's like, well, the last year in 83, the Cubs' run differential was really not that bad. He said it certainly wasn't 19 games under 500 bad. And then he kind of walked through bringing, I guess there's a certain syndrome or factor at the time where if you had a high-intensity manager like Lee Elia, that the Cubs had the year before, and you replace him with Jim Fry, who's kind of laid back and calm, that actually kind of had, it's sort of like in hockey, the Mike Keenan effect, and then you get the guy afterwards who's kind of the
players
guy.
Coach.
Yeah, and players play for that, right? So he looked at that. He looked at how the Cubs had the worst record on artificial turf the year before at 13-35. Yeah, and it turns out, of course, the Cubs, spoiler alert, were 30-18 in those games in 1984. And he looked at the defensive players and things they could do and how their manager, they had a manager, Jim Fry, who had managed the Royals before, and how he was used to AstroTurf and kind of knew how to, negotiate the lineup in a way that would play to those strengths, et cetera. He just kind of went through over and over again, how the Cubs had upgraded their pitching, how they did this, how they young players like Mel Hall and another young outfielder he was really high on, a guy by the name of Joe Carter, who he thought could be an outstanding Major League Baseball player. Go figure. Maybe even get 100 RBIs 10 years in a row, but that's for another day. Anyway, he went on and on to talk about how the Cubs were this sort of in the weeds surprise team that was going to actually shock the world and win the division. Something the Cubs had never done, by the way, won a division, because the last time they went to the playoffs, they didn't have divisions. They had the National League and American League because it was the year 1945.
Jeez.
So it was, to say that the Cubs would make the playoffs when they hadn't in 39 years was kind of a bold statement.
You're on a limb. Yeah.
Yeah, he went out on a limb.
Yeah.
And sure enough, Cubs were in first place on This Week in 1984. So it seemed as if a lot of what Bill James was saying was coming to fruition. I guess we'll just find out next week how that journey proceeded.
If you want to see the document that Pat was displaying, you can see it at our YouTube channel. Make sure you're over at youtube.com.
By the way,
Search for
$6.95. That was an expensive book back then, in 1984.
Definitely was. I think the Cubs played the Reds this week.
It was the best of times and it was the worst of times, Jeremy. The Cubs went 3-3 on the week. Let's just start off saying that. They swept the Braves. They got swept by the Reds. They stayed in first place. But yesterday was the anniversary of one of the darkest days in Cubs history, which was the day the music died when the Cubs traded Bill Buckner,
yes,
who was one of the great greatest players to ever don a Cubs uniform.
Your favorite, Pat?
My all-time favorite. There's a picture of him right here behind me. I remember listening to the AM radio a couple years before when he clinched the batting title over Keith Hernandez and Gary Templeton. It was a big deal. He won the doubles crown with the Cubs. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That was a stat back then. Was just an all-around. He played 7 years with the Cubs. Came over in a trade with Avanda Jesus in exchange for Rick Monday, who was my previous favorite Cub. So that was a big deal. But he was revered. He wept in his press conference when they announced his trade. It was really sad. And someday we'll have a whole podcast just on Bill Buckner because I've got a lot to say about that. But unfortunately, when the Cubs acquired Gary Matthews and Bob Dernier in that trade we've been talking about, Matthews was penciled into left field. It was really the only position he could play. They had no DH back then, which meant that Leon Durham needed a position. And he was kind of a natural first baseman anyway. So that hastened his move to first base, which left Buckner really without a position. So Dallas Green traded him to the Red Sox, where he then took the Red Sox, by the way, to a World Series. First time they'd been in quite a few years.
And then what happened?
Where he wore his Cubs batting glove under his glove during Game 6 of the World Series. Little known fact. Meanwhile, the Cubs acquired a guy named Dennis Eckersley, who had started off with Cleveland, had been traded to Boston, where he won 20 games 1 year and had been a fairly reliable good starter, although had a rough season the year before. So the Cubs were getting a starting, and we talked earlier about how they had basically a 4-man rotation because they didn't really have anybody else, and then they moved Russell into the rotation. But it was, they were still Chuck Rainey and Dick Ruthven. It was a hodgepodge. It was basically still Steve Trout, Scott Sanderson, and 3 question marks. So Eckersley was brought in to be that number 3 starter, which he was, and pitched fairly well for them that year next. So the trade is made, and as back in those days often happened, what happens next? Well, Dennis Eckersley gets to pitch for the Cubs the next day. So flash forward to Sunday, May 27th. Couple notes I'll tell you. So I just too, Matt, rewatched the Cubs the first hour and a half of that game, which took you through 2 innings. Yep. And it was early in the tenure of Harry Carey and Steve Stone as a tandem, which is also kind of fun to watch. Steve Stone was still in his instructional mode for the kids, as opposed to his current shell of himself where he just shills for ownership. And Harry was Harry. So a couple fun facts I'll point out. First, Eckersley's first game, Mario Soto, the ace of the Cincinnati Reds, the opposing pitcher. The game was delayed by 15 minutes. You know why? It wasn't rain. It was because there was a bigger than expected crowd, and they wanted everybody to get into the game. Like before television ruled the day, they're like, "Oh, we'll just start the game 15 minutes later." Over 38,000 fans, biggest skate of the year. And remember, back then that was a sellout. Like that was, a big deal. So we've got this pitching matchup. Eckersley in his first start as a Cub, having just been traded for one of the great Cubs of all time, versus Mario Soto. So we moved to the second inning, the bottom of the second. And Chuck Percy, who was a U.S. Senator from the state of Illinois, pops into the booth to talk to Harry. Great timing. Percy was running for re-election against, as the incumbent, against a challenger by the name of Paul Simon. Remember Paul Simon with the bow ties? So Percy was making the rounds, and it's still the end of May and the election's in November, but he's doing what you do as a politician, right? So he's talking to Harry, and that's when Leon Durham gets a base hit. Great. Then Mel Hall comes up. He had some infamy later, but he at the time drilled a base hit between first and second, and Durham chugged over to third, sore groin and all. He always had groin and hamstring issues his whole career, it seemed like, but Cubs hit first and third and nobody out. Ron Say, the Penguin, comes to the plate, and he launches down the left field line his 8th home run of the year, which would put him one behind Chris Morel on the current team. And it's a 3-run home run. runs around the bases, trots over bases, and the Reds players and manager are upset for reasons unclear. There was at the time a guy named Steve Ripley who was a rookie umpiring third base, and as you know, when a ball is hit down the line and a fair or foul decision has to be made, the third base ump on the left field line and the first base ump on the right field line are basically the decision maker. So he runs down the line, calls it a home run, everybody comes around. Well, when the Reds players and manager come onto the field in this really sort of sad display of crybaby-ish, the umpiring team rallies together. And home plate ump, Paul Runge, unilaterally, in a kind of unprecedented fashion, he had his mask on, by the way, during the entire play. He didn't even see the play. He figures, well, maybe it wasn't a home run. So he calls it a foul ball. It was very rare back in those days to overturn a home run call because they didn't have instant replay, right? The call's the call. The guy who's in charge of making the call made the call. And so this led to the Cubs coming out on the field very righteously and fairly, complaining about what was going on. Meanwhile, Mario Soto, who had already kind of bumped into the umpire once before, and the Reds players are just kind of standing around. As you can imagine, full house on a Sunday, plastic cups fly out of the bleachers. I mean, the outfield is covered in plastic cups.
It was unbelievable.
And, I thought that Don Zimmer was going to have a heart attack. Like, he, at one point, he is bent over his knees, hyperventilating, and they're like, they have their hand on his back to help him breathe. And I was like, oh my God, I think that guy's having a heart attack because he was so worked up and so upset.
Not at one point, at 2 or 3 points, Don Zimmer came out and argued that call so vehemently that multiple times he had to bend over, put both hands on his knees, and huff it out for a little bit, and then resume arguing. Now, Don Zimmer's role, he was not the manager at the time. Jim Fry was the manager. He was the third base coach, right? So he's the guy who's who feels responsible for what's going on at third base. Jim Fry comes out. He goes ballistic. Larry Bowa is upset. Says, man.
Now, wait a second. Jim Fry's ballistic is nothing because I just saw Don Zimmer go ballistic. Like, Don Zimmer, he's the guy who's giving it 110% on this argument. Jim Fry is just
everybody went ballistic within their means, right? Like, it's the best they could. Like Fry went as ballistic as Fry can get.
Yes.
But Fry has his blood pressure is generally low, I think. Like, he probably has to take medicine to keep it up so he doesn't die of of not moving. But Don Zimmer, he's a feisty guy, right? And he was feisty.
For the folks, so if you're listening to this and you haven't seen the video of this, it's on YouTube.
You must watch it.
You have to watch it.
Cubs Reds, May 27, 1984.
We're doing our best for you, and we're going to continue to. There's a lot to unpack here, but you have to see the video. But just for those who aren't seeing it right now and are listening to this, you've never seen an argument like this. You've never seen an argument a little bit like this. It was not, how, do you guys know how baseball arguments work, where a manager comes out and argues with an umpire? This was not that. This was a panel discussion. This was like, the parking space episode of Seinfeld?
Yeah.
Where George and Mike, the guy who called Jerry a phony, are like each stuck in a spot, and the whole neighborhood ends up there bickering over who's right and who's wrong. That happened on a big league field. All 4 umpires, none of whom will walk away and just declare restart the game. All 4 umpires stand there having conversations in turn with Fry, Zimmer, John Vukovic, Larry Bowa, because he was the on-deck hitter. Eventually, Ruben Amaro Sr. comes out of the dugout. The Cubs set an entire delegation. Like, it's a round table out there, and it goes on for 15 minutes. 15 minutes.
The umpires allow it to continue. Like, they do no, like Pat said, nobody walks away and says restart the game, or they toss people out and we're moving on. They stand there. Tell me more. What else do you think about this?
The crew chief was Bob Engel, who is now he's like long gone, but at the time he had already been an umpire for a while, and he'd be around for quite a while longer. And he just had one of those great umpire faces. But what he did not have was a sense of how to just end something. He just stood there with his arms folded, and he listened to everyone's argument, and it just kept going. And we've lost Pat for the moment, but Jeremy, you watched it too, so you have this clear memory of it. The conversation that we got between Harry and Steve during that time was nuts.
It was hilarious. First the debate over whether it was a home run or not was outstanding. Because Steve's like, no, that's super a foul ball. Like, it's not a home run at all. And Harry's trying to make the case maybe it hit the pole. Maybe.
Well, because we had, now we'd have 6 camera angles on this, and it would be very clear because it'd be in high definition. This is 1984, and it's one person taking a tracking shot from behind the plate over down the line, and they didn't do a great job. So we get to the shot, and it's like at the decisive moment, the left field foul pole is at like the left edge of the camera shot, and we're all looking to try to pick out the ball on this grainy screen, but the ball is out of frame because it was foul by a bunch.
Well, there were several possible explanations. There was an explanation from Harry that perhaps the ball had hit the foul pole and gone foul.
And not to make another Seinfeld reference, but that, my friends, is one magic loogie. I mean, it just really would have had to do such a physics-defying dance.
But we were talking.
By the way, this was not a 5-minute delay. Imagine the longest instant replay delay in football or baseball history that you've ever seen for any game, right? Like the most like, oh, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? This was 32 minutes. 32 minutes.
Unreal.
Because, okay, so we haven't even gotten to the other part, right? Is that so they make the wrong call, the Reds argue. They make the right call, the Cubs argue. And again, these massive multi-person arguments that I can't explain how that happened. It never happens in baseball, but it did this time. Just everyone felt they had a valid opinion. So now they're trying. The umpires have some conversation. No one can ever figure out what they were talking about after.
You're not mic'd up.
Right. They finally settled down the Cubs and they sort of retreat to a neutral area. And it seems like it should just be time to resume the game, but the umpires are still talking, and we don't know why.
It's just them talking to each other. Yeah. The four of them are talking, and forever, for a long time. And thank God Steve Stone and Harry Carey were losing their minds at this point, because
they were on the top of their game.
But the weird part was, at some point, the umpires come back to the Cubs, or the Cubs go to the umpires. I think it was Vukovich, and then Harry Carey was suspecting that there had been some arcane rule that Vukovich had uncovered, and therefore the Cubs' home run was going to stand. Right?
No, it looked like John Vukovich had watched every great courtroom drama in Hollywood history and just put it to use right there. He just looked so much like a lawyer coming forward, and he's laying out this and
they're like,
argument.
oh my God, he might be right. And they huddle again, right? Because they don't know. But then they come back and they reject whatever plea he makes. And then Fry goes nuts. He has to be physically restrained by Mel Hall. He throws his jacket to the ground, has to be restrained. Boa has to be physically restrained.
But my favorite part, Jim Fry, I'm sure everyone is picturing the manager, how they'll take their hat or sometimes their jacket and they'll spike it. No, Jim Fry, I think, trying to top Don Zimmer and knowing he couldn't do it, he takes off his jacket and he throws it in the air. He throws it up. It was like, I need the people in the upper deck to see that I am demonstrating.
And the Reds leave the field.
Yeah.
Right? When this is going on,
pulling them off
they're all in the dugout. They're not on the field at all. Eddie Milner's the only one out there, my arch enemy from the Chuck Rainey no-hitter the year before.
So now, from this little pocket of unexplained drama, I have a couple of theories I want to advance. Okay. One is that in the course of this very strange multilateral talks that happen along the third base line, the Cubs decide at some point, we're not going to get it turned back to a home run. Let's try to get, like in appellate court terms, it'd be like post-conviction relief. Let's try and get a little solace from the umpires by going back and saying, you got to eject Mario Soto. He lost his crap. He bumped the umpire. Right. You got to run it. I really kind of think that's what Vukovic went over to talk to them about.
That's a rule. You have to do it. It's non-discretionary.
So then they retreat and they start talking about that. And my other theory is that while they're talking about that, and I'm still not sure they've even decided whether or not to do it, I think Soto just got so sick of this. Again, we were up to almost 20 minutes just on this part. We're almost to 20 minutes in the delay, folks.
The Reds are warming up another pitcher.
They're warming up another pitcher. Soto is so impatient that we get this magic frame, this magic piece of video where Don Zimmer is standing there. It catches him in profile. He is standing, and then he's gone like a bullet.
And the reason he's gone is because Mario Soto shoots out of the dugout and races to kill someone. We don't quite know who.
And Don Zimmer
tackles him.
Yeah. It's like watching history in reverse. Like
Don Zimmer has had 2 heart attacks in the last 20 minutes, and now he's tackling a pretty big guy in Mario Soto.
Or he would have, except Brad Golden, the Reds catcher, who was only trying to hold Soto back.
Right.
Zimmer comes over thinking he's about to help, and Golden, either because he thinks Zimmer's attacking his pitcher for some reason, or just because he couldn't hold Soto back and he was going to bring down someone, tackles Zimmer.
They all go down in a pile.
Now there is a brawl between the two baseball teams. They are fighting each other. They both started out mad at the umpires and not at each other.
Fighting each other.
Yes. Cub bench player Richie Hebner, longtime veteran of the Pirates, he starts wailing on people left and right. It's like a professional boxer on the field.
The Gravedigger's ready to dig a couple in season, man. Yeah. Oh.
Soto then, who by the way was ejected, it turns out, goes back to the dugout, and some fan accidentally spills a beer on him, and he then tries to take a baseball bat and kill the fan, Ty Cobb style, and they have to stop him from doing that.
So they're dragging him, and Harry says to us, again, the narration that these two give us, Harry and Steve, is so
amazing.
Good. Harry says, and now Soto wants to take a bat and go into the stands. Let him. And I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, I'm pretty sure he meant let him go start something with the mob. He's going to lose for sure.
Yes, 100%. 100%. That's exactly it.
So, sadly, I watched this live, by the way, as a child. In my memory, and it's funny how your memory, creates things. I remember Say comes back on the field. They resume the game after 32 minutes. And I thought it was a flyout. It turns out it was a line out to shortstop.
Yeah.
Hit it hard. Out number 1. In my childhood memory, I could have sworn that Say then went ballistic and argued after he'd made the out and got kicked out of the game. But in fact, he didn't. He just went back to the dugout. He was old, and he didn't care. He went 1 for 4 or whatever. He stayed the whole game. So he makes it out, and then the Cubs get no runs in the inning. So you can imagine how ticked off they are. 1st and 3rd, nobody out, and then this all happens. Anyway, Eckersley goes on to pitch a complete 9-inning game, American League style, and loses 4-3.
Eckersley also took his first at bat in 10 years
and
walked.
And did better than Jan Gomes and Miguel Amaya have done in any at bat this year. It was amazing.
See, it all comes full circle.
As I was foreshadowing that earlier when I mentioned the American League pitcher who comes to the National League. I thought, can you imagine if you're Dennis Eckersley? You're like, I pitch in Boston. I've seen some weird stuff. The second inning of my first game ever. And mind you, he didn't come out to pitch for, 40 minutes, 45 minutes maybe. And it didn't bother him. He just kept on going. In today's game, there's no way you would let your starter come back out after a 45-minute delay, right?
I mean, I believe that's true. But it doesn't make the top 10 list of things that happened during this sequence of events that could not possibly happen in today's game. It's just and again, I think it's easy to think, maybe this stuff, things somewhat like it happened somewhat more often 30, 40 years ago and stuff. But even as it's unfolding, Steve Stone is going, I've never seen anything like this.
This is insane. Why are they still talking?
I've never seen umpires who have simply decided the game shall not go
on. So that was the 1984 Week in Review. I
will
gotta say, watch the video. Going 3-3. As we concluded last week on Sunday, they had the 4-3 loss to the Reds, where Ron Say's home run was taken off the board, which
if you didn't hear last week's podcast where we went in depth into this particular Ron Say home run, and go back and listen to last week's episode.
And the unprecedented actions taken by the umpires. So the next game on Monday against the Reds was rained out, probably just as well. And then the Cubs played. They went on a road trip, 6-game road trip against the Braves and the Phillies. Cubs went 3-3. It was fairly ho-hum. We saw Steve Trout had a no-hitter through 7 1/3, and then the Cubs coughed up the lead, and they ended up winning it. And I think did they win it actually? No, I guess he did get the win, but they almost coughed up the lead. So he ended up getting the win in that one. We had the old daily double that was penned by Harry Carey. We had Bob Dernier with a couple of 5-hit games in the leadoff role, and Sandberg had 2 home runs in a game, batting the 2 spots. So that was more daily double action. So, it was an overall decent week. I think the most memorable thing about the week was what happened today, 40 years ago, the Monday of following that week, when the 1984 amateur baseball draft took place. Now, keep in mind, the Cubs had not done well in 1983. In fact, they'd done so poorly that they had earned the right to draft 3rd.
Nice.
Which means they were the 3rd worst team. They had no lotteries back then. It was you earned your spot. So the Cubs took a left-handed pitcher from Morehouse State, very, very highly rated pitcher by the name of Drew Hall. Unfortunately, Drew Hall did not have as successful a career as you'd hope for. He ended up with a lifetime WAR of -1.4, which was in fact the worst of any first-round draft pick. In drafting him, and it's hindsight's 2020, as they say. But the 8th pick overall was Jay Bell, who had a fairly successful career. The 10th pick was a guy named Mark McGuire. Probably could have been helpful at the time. Can you imagine Sosa and McGuire both on the Cubs in 1998? That would have been fun. And then the 24th pick in the first round was future Cub Terry Mulholland. So there you go. So that was the first. This was not a super strong draft in the first round when you look at it top to bottom. Those were sort of the highlights. The Cubs tried to make up for that selection in the second round, where they also drafted 3rd, by taking a right-handed pitcher out of Nevada, a guy by the name of Greg Maddux, who, as it turns out, ended up with 106.6 WAR. So between Drew Hall and Greg Maddux, the Cubs got 53 WAR average out of their top 2 picks, which is one of the highest WAR averages, probably the highest in Cubs history for a first and second pick. So depending on how you slice it, you might say that was the most successful Cubs draft of all time. Then in the 6th round, the Cubs selected another left-handed pitcher named Jamie Moyer, who ended up with 49.8 WAR for his life. So 3 pitchers taken in the first 6 rounds, 2 of whom combined for 600 wins.
And 2 long careers. Yeah.
I guess all 3 of them combined for 600 wins when you look at it that way. But yeah, it was a fairly successful draft in that regard. Other notable players drafted. Tom Glavine was drafted in the 2nd round. Ken Caminetti was drafted in that draft. And I only went through the first 6 rounds. I didn't go any further. But among players drafted in the first 6 rounds, obviously Maddux had the all-time highest WAR, followed by Glavine and McGuire. But Jamie Moyer, the 4th most WAR of any player taken in the first 6 rounds of that draft. So I'd say that was a pretty good draft for Dallas Green and company. And it would portend a somewhat bright future for the late 80s. You always look at the young kids and what they're going to do. So in 84, the Cubs were in the midst of building a pitching staff for 1989. So a couple weeks ago, we talked about how the Cubs had just acquired Dennis Eckersley to go with Scott Sanderson and Steve Trout, and sort of started to build the semblance of a pitching rotation. They had 3 starters now they could rely on. But at this point, this week, they were still relying a lot on Chuck Rainey, who famously almost threw a no-hitter the year before. that Eddie Milner destroyed with 2 outs in the 9th. And then Rick Russell, who the Cubs had reacquired and who had been injured and was really struggling at this point of the season. He had a couple good starts early, but this week he had lost a really rough game. This is foreshadowing, by the way, for next week, just so everybody can pay attention. But the Cubs really needed another starter, I think was obvious from this. They did have one interesting game this week. June 10th, today, 40 years ago, the Cubs beat the Cardinals. It was a Sunday, beat them 2-0. The funny part was how the Cubs scored their 2 runs. They scored the first run when Ryan Sandberg, with the bases loaded, facing Joaquin Andahar, tough pitcher for the Cardinals, was hit by a pitch to drive in the first run. Get an RBI for that, by the way. So the future MVP drove in a run. And then in the 9th inning, the Cubs scored an insurance run on what I would say might be one of the more improbable plays in Cubs history. You don't see this anymore. The Cubs called, with the bases loaded, Cubs called for the old triple steal. Larry Boa stole second. Jody Davis stole third. And Leon Durham stole home. And the Cubs got a second run. And that was just enough. That's all they needed for Lee Smith to shut the door and for the Cubs to bring home the win. And instead of having a 2-4 week, managed to have a 3-3 week and stay in first place. Mid-June in 84, right? So on the field, it was an unmitigated disaster. The Cubs started off strong. They took 2 out of 3 from Montreal. And then they finished by getting swept by the Phillies at home. It was a 7-game homestand, and they were up half a game going into the series, or up a game, and they ended up 2 games out of first place by the end of the week. There were some highlights of the week worth noting. One was, of course, June 12th, 1984, when yours truly, here's my ticket stub from the game.
Wow.
Which I kept all those years. Yours truly sat at the Tuesday 120 game in section 206, row 11. Admission was $5.
$5 for the Terrace Reserve there?
Just a fin, yep.
Nice.
And so sat there, got to see a really good game, actually. Cubs had 4 homers. Gary Matthews Sr. hit a home run. Mel Hall hit his last ever home run as a Cub. We'll get to that in a minute. Jody Davis had 2 home runs in the game. Back then, catchers were allowed to hit home runs, which was great. And Jody Davis hit number 9 and 10 in that game, and increased his RBI total to 44. Yeah, the Cubs. You look at the Cubs lineup, and you look at the OPSs back then: Dernier 802, Sandberg 839, Matthews 772, Durham 967, Mel Hall 805, Ronce 750, Jody was at 907. You know, all those sort of as good or better than any Cub today. I did go back and look at the box score for that game, and you know they're playing the Expos, and I've always said go to Montreal, go to a Expos game there if you ever get a chance. But I looked at the lineup from the Expos that day, and at the time it didn't really resonate with me as much. But here were the first 6 batters in the lineup for the Expos that day. You ready? Tim Raines, Pete Rose, Andre Dawson, Gary Carter, Tim Wallach, and Terry Francona.
Jesus.
Well, the first 4 are in the Hall of Fame.
Yep.
Francona probably will be as a manager, I'm guessing. And
Yep.
Tim Wallach was a damn good third baseman. That was a pretty good lineup, right?
That is nice.
So I got to see 4 Hall of Famers on that team. And, of course, I got to see on the Cubs several Hall of Famers, but I got to see Ryan Sandberg, Hall of Famer, and Dennis Eckersley started the game. So there's another Hall of Famer. So 6 Hall of Famers appeared in that game.
Wow. That's awesome.
Eckersley got the win. 7 innings, pitched well, but the Cubs' troubles continued. The rest of the week, pitching troubles for sure, and they lost 4 straight to the Phillies at home. That was devastating at the time. And you know the Cubs had this. They called it the June swoon back in those days. But the Cubs had a track record of not doing well in the middle and late June and falling out of contention. So this was a big deal. Russell got bombed. Rainey pitched poorly. It was just one of those deals. But interesting news, the day after I went to the game, probably spurred on from my attendance, the Cubs made a trade. They traded the aforementioned Mel Hall, along with a young player who had come up in '83 for a cup of coffee, as they would say, by the name of Joe Carter, and a few other unknown, not worthy of mentioning players. And the Cubs acquired in that deal a guy by the name of Rick Sutcliffe, who was a starting pitcher for Cleveland at the time, and had the year before won 17 games and been an all-star. The year before that with Cleveland, he led the league in ERA. And 3 years before that, he was the rookie of the year with the Dodgers, who he came up with. So this was like a legit ace pitcher the Cubs acquired. To go with an Eckersley, to go with a Trout, to go with a Sanderson. And now all of a sudden, the Cubs had themselves a rotation. It was a steep price to give up, but Rick Sutcliffe would go on to finish 16-1 that season. His .941 winning percentage was one of the highest in, I don't think it's ever been toppled in Major League history since, but quite good. And he was one of what should have been 2 Cy Youngs for him. He got robbed of another one later on, but basically was a catalyst for getting the Cubs into 2.69 ERA too, getting them into the playoffs that year. So it worked out very well for the Cubs at the time. Now, they did give up Joe Carter, who really started to come into his own in 1986. So like 2 years later, and you knew it was coming. He was a good player, and you hate giving him up. That's the way good trades work, right? You give up a young player and you get a cost-controlled veteran who you're going to have for, in fairness, the next 5 years. I mean, Rick Sutcliffe would take the playoffs a couple times, and those are the Hobson's deals you have to make. Joe Carter with Cleveland did quite well. Then he was with San Diego for a year. Then he went to Toronto, where he single-handedly won not one but 2 consecutive World Series titles for Toronto.
Yep.
So
the real story here is that the Cubs made a trade with not Philadelphia.
Yes, yeah. And it was the first. And Rick Sutcliffe had never played for the Phillies. So that was a highly unusual move for them in this era of baseball. But it was certainly a risky move by Dallas Green, but one that I think, those they say, well, both teams, it worked out for both teams. In this case, I think it actually did. The Cubs also got a relief pitcher named George Frazier in the deal, who had some middling success. Well, middling is perhaps a little too effusive, but was a pitcher thereafter. Rick Sutcliffe was basically formatted this rotation and allowed the Cubs to start to move some other guys out of the rotation. And really, the team was starting to coalesce around the team they had. They also, in trading Mel Hall, just like with the Bill Buckner trade for Dennis Eckersley, kind of opened things up so that the players that they had could play more regularly. So Durham was now the permanent first baseman. With Hall traded, that opened up right field for Keith Moreland to play consistently, Sonk, as we call him. And then, you Junior in center and Matthews in left. And so the roster had settled at this point, and that was something that they had needed to do because they had a few too many players in order to get everybody the at-bats they needed and to be effective. So.
And kudos to Dallas Green for doing it early. This is mid-June and making a move because he was confident that the way this team was performing, it's something they hadn't seen in decades. So didn't want to waste it.
The only downside, of course, because there's always a downside, is Sutcliffe wasn't able to pitch until the following Tuesday, June 19th. Because they screwed up the paperwork, Dallas Green did, when you made a trade across divisions at this point in the season. You had to file waiver paperwork for players, and they hadn't done that for Hall and Carter or whatever. So it took they had to wait basically a week to get that the paperwork to follow up. And then when they did, he was able to officially for the Cubs, and there was some I saw some joke on Twitter the other day where Sutcliffe had said that after that Philly series, they were getting bombed, and the pitching coach calls all the pitchers in, and he starts yelling at them, and he says, you're terrible, and he looks at Sutcliffe, and he's like, you haven't done anything yet. And Sutcliffe's looking at him like, I'm not allowed to pitch. I'm just standing here. And they're supposed to well, then do better or something, So that was kind of funny, and do better he did, obviously. Once he finally got the green light from Major League Baseball to actually play for the Cubs. So so exciting times. 2 games out of first place, but with a lot of hope for the future. It was one of the greatest June weeks in Chicago sports history, because if you want to go back day by day, Monday was the day the Bulls drafted Michael Jordan, probably the most important draft pick in the history of Chicago sports.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Tuesday, Rick Sutcliffe finally got to make his first start as a Cub. As you recall, there was a waiver wire issue with paperwork that delayed him starting, and he had a shutout going into the 9th inning and a 4-0 lead, and gave him a walk and an error and a hit. And they took him out, and Lee Smith walked 3 guys, including a couple of runs in, but the Cubs ended up managing to win, and they won the game 4-3. So Sutcliffe got a win in his first start as a Cub, pitched very well in that game. So that was nice to see. Rest of the week, the Cubs kind of scuffled. I used to play the Pirates, and they lost the next couple games on Wednesday and Thursday. Then they lost to the Cardinals on Friday. So that takes us into the Saturday game. And as you know from talking about last week, the Cubs are kind of scuffling right now. They've been through a couple weeks now where they hadn't played pretty well. They were starting to fall a little bit out of first place, a couple games out at this point. So that was concerning. So that takes us to the Saturday game, which is often referred to as the Sandberg game. So that is today is the 40-year anniversary of that day, on June 23rd. And let me just start by saying I watched the game as a kid on TV. It was I remember watching it because I watched all the Cubs games. I had nothing to do. We had no internet.
No, and that was like an NBC game of the week.
And I want to try to impress on people who maybe are not from that era. The people who are will certainly understand this. But if you weren't from that era, imagine that you've got like 4, maybe 5 television stations. You have no internet. You have very limited capacity to watch or to view or to intake any sort of media. And your favorite sport is baseball, and there are 2 national games a week. There's a Monday night baseball game, and there's a Saturday afternoon baseball game. And you've spent your entire life watching the Yankees and the Red Sox and the Dodgers play in those games pretty much regularly. Every once in a while, the Cubs would get to play on a Monday night. They would always lose. And occasionally they get to play on a Saturday, but it was few and far between. You could go a couple seasons without seeing the Cubs on a national game, right? Because there were 2 a week and then none in the football season, right? So, I mean, it was just basically 2 a week, from like April to August. So the fact that the Cubs were even on the national game was in and of itself a big deal. It was on NBC, the professional broadcasters. And
Bob Costas. So this is
Bob
no
Costas.
joke. Yeah.
And the Cubs began the game like they often did when they had their rare opportunities to shine. Steve Trout got shelled and knocked around, gave up 7 runs in an inning and a third. So Cubs quickly fell down by a lot. And that was sort of what we expected. And, the Cardinals were down. It was a packed house. At that point, people were excited about the Cubs, and on the weekends, they were packing the place. Brian Sandberg, who, by the way, in that game went 5 for 6. His 1 out was a RBI ground out. It's 7 RBIs in that game. Scored a couple of runs, and so he was impactful the whole game. Starting in like the first inning, Dernier gets on base, he steals second. Sandberg gets a base hit, drives him home. So we move all the way to the 9th inning of that game, and the Cubs are down by 1 run at this point. And the Cardinals have the best closer in baseball, a guy named Bruce Sutter. And this is particularly painful for Cubs fans because Bruce Sutter was a Cub closer who won the Cy Young as the Cubs closer and was the best closer in baseball as a Cub, but had been traded a couple years before in a trade that netted basically ultimately just really Leon Durham. Among useful players, Ty Waller and Ken Reitz kind of washed out. So the Cubs got Leon Durham for it. So it wasn't like they got nothing, but it is always frustrating when your former closer is the closer for the other team. So Sandberg comes up, and at the time, I guess he would have been, 3 for 4? So he comes up, and it's ninth inning, and he hits a home run, ties the game. And Suter's goes, and Suter didn't give up home run. He was a really good pitcher. And so big moment, Sandberg comes around, scores, ties the game. And of course, the next inning, what do the Cubs do? They take that momentum, they go back out, and they give up 2 runs in the 10th. So now they're down 11-9 because Sandberg had tied the game 9-9. Now it's 11-9, and you don't have a great feeling about this. You especially didn't have a great feeling because unlike the first homer where Sandberg led off the 9th with a home run, in the 10th inning, the Cubs started off with 2 outs. So that's not great. And then at that point in time, we didn't have this available at the time, but the wind forecast, Cardinals were at the 99% mark because Bruce Sutter's still on the mound because back then closers could pitch multiple innings. It wasn't like today. So he's on the mound. Other than the 1 home run, he's fine, right? He's doing fine. So he gets the first 2 outs, and Bobby Dernier draws a walk. So much like my internet going out, NBC had decided that the game was pretty much over, and they started showing the credits for the executive producer and all the other stuff they would scroll because it was extra innings and they had other programming they wanted to get to. Probably want to show Bambi or something. So they're trying to get through this, and then Sandberg steps up and crunches another home run, and Bob Costas is just going crazy because this was really the first time that Sandberg had become really seen on the national front, and he was having a fantastic season, right? And he was Gold Glove caliber. He's hitting 320 or whatever he was, something. He just having a great year. We talked about this already, but he hits another home run off Bruce Suter. I think Bruce Suter had never given up 2 home runs to the same batter before, and Suter's just beside himself, ties the game, and people are just completely like, it was just pandemonium up there. It was just one of those amazing experiences, and so. The Cubs are able to tie the game, and that's why that game is called the Sandberg game. Now, you may ask, well, that just tied the game at 11, right? What happened after that? And the answer is, Cubs did win the game, and they won it in the 11th inning. However, Ryne Sandberg didn't factor in because he didn't come up to bat yet. There was not enough time for him to come back up and hit. So the sort of the trivia question that I like to ask people, since everybody they assume Ryne Sandberg hit like a walk-off home run in the game, which obviously isn't the case. What actually happened was that I guess it would have been, Cubs get out of the top of the 11th, and in the bottom of the 11th, Leon Durham, who was the player the Cubs acquired, in exchange for Suter, led off the inning with a walk. Steals second, goes to third on the throw. There's air on the throw. Then they intentionally walk Keith Moreland, and they intentionally walk Jody Davis. So bases are loaded, nobody out, and the infield is in, and Cubs backup utility man. Imagine Miles Mastrobuoni coming up, or maybe Nick Madrigal. A guy named Dave Owen comes up and gets a base hit through the drawn-in infield that would have been probably a double play otherwise, but the run would have scored. So they had to have the infield in, right? And gets a base hit through the infield, and the Cubs win. They stop the losing streak. They win the next day, Sunday, so they salvage the week. They go 3-3 on the week. But starting that day, if you look at the rest of the season, the Cubs just caught fire, and we'll get into how they did the rest of the season. But needless to say, much like the 2015 team, it's great to be 5 games over 500. It's great also to be 30 games over 500. And they were in that transitional point where they were going to go from one to the other. So it was fantastic. And I remember my parents had another couple over because they were cooking out. Because remember, it's late in the day now. And they were over and they were doing a barbecue. And I was screaming and yelling, and my dad runs in, and I said, Sandberg hit a home run. He's like, yeah, I know. You told me. I'm like, no, he did it again. He's like, what? He's like, Suter's still pitching. I'm like, I know. So he ended up watching the last inning with me on TV, and the two of us are just sitting there while everybody else is like, probably irritated that like all food processing had stopped. But it was one of those moments where you're like, this was a big deal, and then the Cubs won, and it was so that was a very memorable game. It's referred to as the Sandberg game. It was sort of a coming out party for Sandberg and for really the '84 Cubs in general, for the rest of the country, because millions of people were watching this game and were seeing the Cubs for the first time that season, for sure. And maybe for the first time in a couple seasons, to be honest with you, because it had been a while. It had been over a decade since the Cubs finished over 500. So we weren't exactly on teams' radars and fans' radars as much. But the Cubs in the following week went 5-3, fairly decent filling. But of interesting note, they started the week. So the Sandberg game's on a Saturday, and everybody remembers what a great game that was. What people don't remember is what happened on Sunday. Sunday was Rick Sutcliffe's second start as a Cub, where he proceeded to blank the Cardinals 5-0, 5-hit shutout, 14 strikeouts. Got a nice game score of 90, for that. Just a like dominant start, which improved his record to 2-0 as a Cub starter. Spoiler alert, it was going to get better, but it was just one of those moments where it's like, oh, well, isn't it nice to have an ace pitcher like that, especially following a game that went into extra innings where you had to use a lot of, a lot more relievers than you might have wanted to otherwise. So it was definitely worth noting that he was on his game. And then later in the week, the Cubs played the Dodgers at LA, which has always been tough for them. And the Cubs won 3 out of 4, which is also a big week. Rick Sutcliffe lost his one and only game of the season later that week. But don't worry, because at 2-1, things would only improve for him for the rest of the way. But the interesting part about the Cubs back then, because the narratives as we look back and reflect, it's like this teleological trap where we say, well, this was the year of Sandberg this, Sandberg that. You know who the big player of June was for the Cubs? Wasn't Sutcliffe, he just got there. Wasn't Sandberg. It was this guy, Sports Illustrated cover man, Leon Durham, who was having a monster season with the Cubs, which was important because, as we talked about in the Sandberg game, the Cubs traded their ace closer, Bruce Sutter, in a deal to acquire, among others. Leon Durham was sort of the centerpiece, the young first baseman. He had a lot of faith in. They also got Ken Reeds, who didn't work out, who's a third baseman who just started sucking the minute he got here. But Leon Durham was the big bat at the time, and he was just having a phenomenal season. So he was the first Cub of the year to make the cover of Sports Illustrated. So there you go. And they have an article on the Cubs, and it's kind of an interesting.
If you're watching on the YouTube channel, that's where Pat is showing you the actual visual of the Sports Illustrated. Go ahead and show.
It's called A Family Feud in Philadelphia, and it was about the fact that the Cubs, as we've discussed several times, were Dallas Green, who'd come from Philadelphia. They were just trading players back and forth. Whenever one team needed something and they had extras, they would just give. The Cubs made a trade a couple years before. First of all, the Sandberg trade obviously is the big one we all remember, because the Cubs got Boa and Sandberg and gave up Avante Jesus. But I forgot the Cubs had given up Mike Krukow and gotten Keith Moreland in return like the year before that. And the spring training, the Cubs got Matthews and Dernier for Bill Campbell, because Dernier was just sitting on the bench. And they talk about that in the article about how the Phillies players, first of all, every Phillies player loved Gary Matthews, by the way.
Yeah.
Sarge, they loved him. And they, throughout this whole article, they talk about it. And they're all, the first time the two teams met, which was this week, they were, hanging out with them and shaking his hand and coming over to the Cubs dugout and whatnot before the games. They were also super happy for Dernier that he was actually getting a chance to play, because he'd been a bench player in Philadelphia. Maybe it was a different era in baseball. I suppose it was in some respects, but there just seemed to be this general affinity amongst the two teams, because half the players in these games had played for the other team at one point. Manny Trio had been a Cub, and he was so. I mean, you had like 5 starters on one team and 4 on the other that had come from each other. Not to mention the pitchers. So there was a lot of positive, and it wasn't in a negative way either. There was just a lot of positive vibes between the two teams. mind you, they're in the same division, the same league, when only one team from your division even makes the playoffs. So, I mean, there's that going on, but they definitely, and Dallas Green really picked them clean, as it turns out. I mean, the Cubs really, and look, the Phillies were a loaded team, and they had their own vision going. Even so, I think objectively, when you look back on it over time, the Cubs did really well there. And so, yeah, it makes you wonder, is there any way the Cubs could do that now? Apparently not, but it sure would be nice, especially with a team like the Guardians that has a lot of interesting, players in their other team and in their farm system. But here we are instead, kind of meandering around, not sure what we're going to do. But it's definitely worth reading. If you get the June Sports Illustrated here, you can read about them Cubbies. I will note sort of there is an anecdote later in the magazine in the baseball part, where pitcher Dennis Eckersley was interviewed. He had come over from the Cubs in that Red Sox trade for the near Hall of Famer Bill Buckner. And so Eckersley, when traded to the Cubs, remember there was no DH in the National League. It was the first time he'd ever been in the National League. He says, quote, "My arms are killing me. My back's killing me." This is about batting practice. He was in tremendous pain. First game, he goes out, he goes 0 for 2, ground out and a strike on his first 2 at-bats. He said, "I don't feel that good." And then the next game, his second game as a major leaguer, he got a base hit. So already he was more valuable than Miguel Amaya in just his second game as an offensive threat. And then there's one other sort of Cub-related anecdote. Do you remember Dave Kingman, Cub home run great, hit the 48 homers and was an all-star? Kingman played for like 7 different teams. He was pretty mercurial. He was known for getting into arguments with the press. Although at one point in time, he did have the record for the most home runs for a player never to make the Hall of Fame. I think it was like 435 or something before the steroid era kind of, threw that sort of away. But he was with Oakland at the time. And he had an incident on a Monday when Kingman, who was leading the league with 14 home runs, by the way, in the first 2 months of the season. So, typical Kingman. He was ejected by first base ump Steve Palermo because he disagreed with Palermo's call on a check swing appeal. He said, quote, "Tell Palermo he's got the worst case of bad breath I've ever seen. He's got to cut down on the garlic," Kingman said after the game. So the next day, Kingman singles in his first at bat. And 20 feet out of the box, he turns to yell at Palmeiro, who was at that point the first base ump. And at the same time he stumbled and fell. He got up and made it to first base, but it turns out he tore a ligament in his left knee, turning to mock the umpire for whom he was called out on a check swing the day before. So there you go. Baseball in the 80s. You can't beat it. So.
Yeah. Well, we needed that palate cleanser.
Then when he tore a ligament in your knee, he was only out for 1 week. So because they didn't really use the ligaments weren't that strong back then.
I was going to say, if you ever watched Dave Kingman play defense, the knee ligaments weren't important.
Yeah. Really. Imagine if they'd had a DH in the National League. My goodness. It was a good week. Cubs went 5-2. Rick Sutcliffe, had now firmly taken over his spot in the rotation, is quickly becoming the ace of the rotation. He won both games he pitched deep into the games. Trout was pitching well. Sanderson, you're starting to Eckersley, you're starting to see the formation of the team. Durham is at first base now. You've got guys kind of fitting into their roles, I think, now finally. And this was a particularly interesting week. There wasn't a whole lot to say about the week, from what I could tell, other than that this was the continuation of the dreaded West Coast road trip. So back in the old days, we had the National League East and the National League West. The National League West consisted of Los Angeles Dodgers, San Diego Padres, San Francisco Giants, and of course, because it was the West, Cincinnati Reds and Atlanta Braves. I don't make this. I don't make the rules here. I just report on them, right? And so the Cubs every year had to go on a West Coast road trip, and these were brutal road trips. Typically, the Cubs would inevitably, really suck. They had to go out to the West Coast, I think, twice a year back in those days, and so they would do 2 of these trips every year. And every year they would come back battered and beaten, having gotten absolutely like crushed, whether it was the time shift or whatever it was, playing good teams, they would always lose. So this was a particularly bad trip because the Cubs start off with 4 games against the Dodgers, then 3 at San Diego, and then 4 at San Francisco. So it was an 11-game stretch.
That's a long stretch.
It is a long stretch, especially in those days. Pre-internet, they had nothing to do after the game. They couldn't go on their phones. They had no phones. All they could do is go out and cause trouble, which is probably what they were doing. And they had won 3 out of 4 from the Dodgers to start off the stretch. They beat Fernando Valenzuela. All was good, and so it got off to a good start. And then in this last week that we are reporting on, the Cubs played 3 games, first against the San Diego Padres, where the Cubs took 2 out of 3. Mind you, at the time, we didn't realize the significance of playing the Padres, but it was, as it turns out, fateful. Most notably, by beating the Padres 2 out of 3, the Cubs retook possession of first place. They hadn't been in first place since the middle of June. They'd gone into a little bit of a June swoon. So now on the road, in 7 games into this road trip, the Cubs had regained first place, and Rick Sutcliffe beat future Cub enemy Eric Show. You might remember him. He's the one who intentionally threw a baseball at Andre Dawson's face after Dawson had a very successful series against the Padres, and as a reward for that was almost murdered on the field. First by Rick Sutcliffe, and then later on by Andre Dawson. And that, if we ever get into the 1987 Cubs, that would be the story of that one. He was chased into the clubhouse and had to be escorted out of the stadium by Chicago police for fear of safety of his own life, and then he had to leave the city that day. Anyway, but back in 1984, he was just John Birch Society, San Diego Padre losing to the Cubs, and he did, and the Cubs beat him. So then the Cubs went to San Francisco, where they proceeded to take 3 out of 4, also very impressive. Sutcliffe won the last game of that trip, and now you're starting to see the real impact. We talked last week about how Sutcliffe in his first couple games had pitched really well, and like a 9-inning, pitched 9 innings in one game. Well, here he had pitched against the Padres 8.1 innings, giving up 1 unearned run. I mean, that's kind of ace stuff. And because the Cubs had been taxing their bullpen so much this year from a lot of short starts by some of their other starters who were no longer in the rotation, it really helped them to have Sutcliffe come in. He threw 7 1/3 in the second game that he pitched. So, he's pitching 2 games on the West Coast, and he's pitching all but 2.1 innings of those 2 games. I mean, that's nice. Lee Smith can come in and throw 2 pitches. That's fine, right? That was sort of where we're at. So the Cubs came back and beat the Padres 3 out of 4. Lee Smith got the save in that game, and as he did in the first game, and the Cubs now had we're on top of the division, and things were looking good. I mean, if you had told me at any time at that, I don't even know if it ever happened, frankly, in my lifetime up until then. But the Cubs are 8-3 on this West Coast road trip, which was fantastic.
Who was the team in the NL East behind the Cubs that was jockeying for that first place position at the time?
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because actually there were a couple teams that were kind of in the mix there. Throughout the course of the season, they would go up and down, but actually the Phillies started off as the team, which is kind of, interesting given the fact that the Cubs had made so many trades with the Phillies. The Cardinals were right there, and the Mets, who would really become sort of the Cubs, I think, not foils, but rivals, later in the season, were also kind of lurking around. So there were 4 teams in the East that year that were all fairly good.
Well, I will give you a kind of a brief summary here. Last we talked, the Cubs had gone on an 11-game West Coast road trip. They'd gone 8-3 against the Dodgers, Padres, and Giants. They then went into the All-Star break, where the Cubs had 2 representatives on the 1984 All-Star team. They had their first, for the first time ever, starting second baseman Ryan Sandberg, who would then start the All-Star game at second base for basically a decade thereafter. He got the start And Jody Davis made the team as a reserve. There were, I counted 7 other former Cubs that were made the All-Star team, just not Cubs at the time. And the Cubs the National League, won the game 3-1, as they always did back then. And by always, I mean literally almost every year back in those days. The game was played in San Francisco at Candlestick Park. 57,000 people. Candlestick Park, I didn't realize it held that many. But it was a 3-1 victory. Nothing really huge on the Cub front. But I think Jody Davis got the one at bat, and Sandberg was 1 for 4. But it was a nice win. And then the Cubs followed that up by coming home and playing 11 games against the very same Dodgers, Padres, and Giants that they had played before. So 22 consecutive games against 3 teams. So if you think the schedules are kind of weird now, imagine playing 22 games in a row against the same 3 teams. Unfortunately, the Cubs were only 6-5 on the homestand, kind of win, lose, win, lose. They ended up they started the homestand half a game out of first place, and they ended up 2.5 out. So the Cubs were still, at the end of the homestand, they were still 13 games over 500, but they were 2.5 games out. They were in second place. In fact, the Cubs basically had been in either first or second for the last several weeks before then, and would never fall below second the rest of the season. But things were about to change for the better. Rick Sutcliffe, 6-1 with the Cubs already. You remember we just acquired him in June, and he rolled through. He had 2 more wins that week, and was doing really well. Lee Smith was starting to hit his groove as closer. Leon Durham was scorching the ball. Sandberg was having a great season. Jody Davis was having a great season. So there was a lot of positives on the horizon, but the Cubs were sitting fairly well headed into next week.
Our Chicago Cubs were on a 7-game East Coast road trip, 3 against the Phillies, 4 against the Mets, the first place Mets. The Cubs won 2 out of 3 against Philadelphia. Rick Sutcliffe had another great, outstanding performance.
He's been on fire.
He's been on fire. Got the win. And then the Cubs went to New York after winning those 2 out of 3 and took on the first place Mets. Cubs lost the first game 2-1 because this guy, Dwight Gooden, pitched really well. And Dick Ruthven pitched well for the Cubs too, in fairness. But it's a 2-1 loss. The Cubs fell 4.5 games back to the Mets. So if you want to look at some hope for how you can be 4.5 back and then turn things around, just look back to 1984. This is what the Cubs need to start doing, right? They lost the first game. Second game, it's 3-3 going into the 8th inning. The Cubs really needed to win this game, right? They want to fall 5.5 back. And Ryan Sandberg leads off with a walk. And it's the first of 12 batters to come to the plate that inning, where the Cubs end up putting 8 runs on the board. They win the game 11-4, and they even up the series with the Mets to get to 3.5 back. That Sunday, they played a doubleheader because, as you may recall, early in the season, they had been rained out from a game at Shea, back when they were having all those rainouts. Back in these days, a doubleheader meant you would play a game, and then you would wait 30 minutes from the conclusion of that game, and you would start the next game, right? Same fans, same things. It was great. So you'd play at noon and 3 typically, or 3:15, depending on how late the first game went. This might have been and this is against a first-place team that had a lot of talent offensively. This Cubs team had one of the best pitching doubleheaders I can recall. Maybe there's been a better one since, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. So in the first game of the doubleheader, Steve Trout pitched a 9-inning complete game shutout.
Wow.
A manager's delight, right? You're playing a doubleheader, and your starting pitcher just threw a shutout in game 1. You're like, oh, thank God, right? Cubs won 3-0. They're only 2.5 back. They're on a roll. Unfortunately for the Cubs, they were not able to exploit all those fresh relief pitchers in game 2 because Scott Sanderson pitched 7 2/3 innings and only gave up 1 run. They went straight to Lee Smith, who got the last 4 outs, and the Cubs won the game 5-1 behind home runs. Sandberg's 14th homer of the year, and Jody Davis hit his 15th of the year. So in the course of one day, the Cubs starting pitchers went 16 2/3 innings, giving up only 1 run. pretty good, I think, for a doubleheader. I'm trying to think of a better one they've had since, but that's right up there with any of them. So the Cubs came back to Chicago only a game and a half behind the Mets. They were definitely making up ground. It was a big series. It kind of put the Cubs in a unique position because they only had forward momentum after that. And I don't want to give everything away, but let's put it this way. They never were more than a game and a half back the rest of the season. The Cubs started off the week a half a game behind the Mets, second place. And they ended up the week a half a game ahead of the Mets in sole possession of first place, something that they would not relinquish for the rest of the year.
Huge.
So big week. They were 5-2 that week, beating the Phillies 2 out of 3. You know, the Phillies, half our team were Phillies at the time, or recent Phillies.
Right.
And then beating Montreal 3 out of 4. Sorry, Andre Dawson, but the Cubs beat them. But there were a couple memorable things that happened that week. Most memorable would be the August 2nd game, where the Cubs beat the Expos 3-2. I watched this game live on television, and I remember quite well watching this happen. So here, let me give you the setup. So Sutcliffe starts the game. He goes 8 1/3, gives up 8 hits, 2 runs, 10 strikeouts, pitches a dominant game. Runs out of gas. So they bring Lee Smith in, the closer. And they're men at first and third. There's 1 out. The batter is Pete Rose. Cubs are up by 1. So a fly ball or a weak grounder that doesn't result in a double play is probably going to give up a run. So Rose lines a ball hard up the middle. It hits Lee Smith in the shoulder, caroms into the air, and is caught on the fly by Dave Owens, who was the hero of the Sandberg game because he actually drove in the winning run in that game, not Ryan Sandberg. Owens then takes it and throws to first to double off Don Stanhouse, who's a pitcher who was pinch running for some reason. I don't know why. Don't remember. And the Cubs win on that double play, which Harry Carey, in all of his glory and late in the game after many a cocktail, began referring to as the immaculate deflection game. So the Cubs won the game. It would have been a base hit up the middle easily had it not hit Smith in the shoulder. Had it done what every other ball does when it hits a pitcher in the shoulder and gone to the ground, tying run scores. But instead, it caromed into the air all the way to shortstop and led to a somewhat rare 1-6-3 double play. And the Cubs won the game 3-2 to start off the week. Later that week, on August 5th, the Cubs would win a game. Keith Moreland remember when the Cubs had traded Buckner and they traded Mel Hall and Joe Carter. They were opening up space in the outfield. Durham had moved to first base. You had Matthews in left, Dernier in center. Well, Keith Moreland, Zonk, as they called him, who I think was a running back at like Texas or Texas A&M, I think, in undergrad. He was playing right field for the Cubs. He hits a grand slam. Cubs win the game 4-3. All the runs scored off the grand slam. So a timely hit. But the Cubs were flying high. They were at home. They'd won 5 out of 7. They had a huge series coming up against the Mets. Remember last week we talked about how they had gone to New York and taken 3 out of 4 from the Mets to kind of climb back into it. So now they were about to face the Mets next week, and with a perilous but still half game lead. It's probably the latest the Cubs had been in first place since, if not 1969, then the very early 1970s. I can tell you that. So all was well in Wrigleyville, and for all the talk now, 40 years later, about the Sandberg game was the pivotal moment, blah blah blah. The immaculate deflection game, I can't tell you enough about how that was one of those vibes games, right? Where you're like, maybe, just maybe, the gods are on our side for a change, because that's not something that happens to the Cubs. No way. Pete Rose, the all-time hits leader, is gonna get robbed, and not just robbed, but it's gonna turn into a game-ending double play. That doesn't happen to the Cubs. This was a great week for the Cubs. Last week was a great week for the Cubs, and this week. And these were the 2 weeks that kind of put them. They were 4.5 under behind the Mets, and then they were up half a game last week. Like they made that big switch because they won 3 out of 4 against the Mets. This week, the Cubs played Montreal for 4 and the Mets for 4 because they had, remember all those rainouts in April? Well, they're playing a lot of doubleheaders this week. So the Cubs played 8 games in 7 days. This is before the Players Association was really pushing for those things. And they weren't doing day-night doubleheaders. They're like, we start 30 minutes after the first game ends. So, it's a cheap ticket. Cubs were at home. They started the week half a game in first place. They ended the week 4.5 games ahead of the Mets. So it was a big week. And that was done in large part because the Cubs swept the Mets in the 4 games. Sutcliffe had 2 wins this week. They beat Gooden. They crushed Ron Darling. They beat future Cub general manager Ed Lynch and Walt Terrell. In fact, the Ed Lynch game was funny because apparently during this series there was a beanball war back and forth, and at one point after hitting a home run, I think Keith Moreland got thrown at by Ed Lynch. I can't imagine Ed Lynch like throwing at somebody because I think of him more as a older general manager. And then Moreland, who was famously like a linebacker at the University of Texas or something, charged the mound and decided to like tackle him, like literally like you would tackle someone if you were a linebacker. So that was fun. And then, it was a bench clearing brawl or whatever. After the game, Moreland said, "I'm sure Eddie Lynch was doing what he thought proper at the time. If he'd been throwing at my head, that would have been a different story. He would have been messing with my life. So I have no hard feelings towards anybody, blah, blah, blah. And, but I did go out there and try to kick his ass." So, that was, it's baseball in the 80s, right? Like that happened all the time. And it was objected, of course. They just continued playing baseball like after a physical confrontation. But it was a great week for the Cubs. Even in the one loss to Montreal that Dennis Eckersley threw, I'll read you his line. Now the Cubs lost in 10 innings, 1-0, but Eckersley went 9 innings, gave up 0 runs, 4 hits, 2 walks, 2 strikeouts. Can you imagine in today's baseball if a starting pitcher went 9 shutout innings and only struck out 2 batters? But it was more of a play to contact era, I guess, back then. So people swung and they missed or they hit a lot of balls in play. So it was a great week for the Cubs. This kind of cemented. We look back at the 84 season and people will refer to the Sandberg game against the Cardinals in June and say, that's when we knew that the Cubs were winning. That's bullshit. That's garbage. No, it wasn't. It was just a great game on a Saturday on national TV and we were all super excited. And that might have been the time when people started to figure out who Ryan Sandberg was. But what really, I think, convinced people the Cubs were for real was these 2 weeks when they beat the Mets 7 out of 8 games and took a commanding lead at first place. Because the Cubs hadn't been in first place in August in like 11 years, right? So this was like a big deal, for the Cubs. And so being 4.5 up in cruise control here in the middle of August, all was good on the north side of Chicago. The Cubs then turned around this week. And by the way, this is a team that's like 21 games over 500. So we're not talking about just a 3-game under 500 kind of thing. Cubs are 4.5 games ahead of the Mets in first place back when there were 2 divisions in the National League. So that's, a notable thing. And the Cubs had a kind of a bad week, actually. They got swept by the Astros in 3 games. They lost the first game of a series to the Reds in Cincinnati. And as a Cubs fan, you're like, oh boy, here we go again, right? But the Cubs did rebound in the next 2 games against the Reds, and they won 2. So they actually had a 2-4 week, much like this Cubs team. And they did lose ground in the standings. They went from 4.5 up to 2.5 up. But the beauty of having a 4.5 game lead is you can have a bad week and still be 2.5 games up, right? And make it up the next week, which is sort of where the Cubs were at this point. What I would say about the week, and I think I'm going to do a little spotlight here on a certain player, those last 2 games in Cincinnati when, you've got a team with a combination of some young players and some veterans. They brought a lot of veterans in. One of those veterans they brought in the year before, in 1983, actually. The Cubs had made a trade with the Los Angeles Dodgers to bring in a guy by the name of Ron Cey, who had been a 6-time All-Star with the Dodgers and was sort of in his later years, right? The Dodgers had this great infield with Garvey and Lopes and Bill Russell and Ron Say, and they were kind of dismantling that and going through their own sort of retool or whatever, and bringing some younger players. And the Cubs under Dallas Green were able to go out and acquire the very expensive Ron Say. He made like $900,000, if you can believe that. A lot of money for the Cubs. But in these two games, in the first game in particular, he went 3 for 5, but he hit a big home run in the 8th inning that put the Cubs ahead for good in a game where they had taken the lead, they'd fallen behind. And, when you've lost 4 in a row, you start to get, it starts to cascade a little bit. So he righted the ship. And in the very next game on Sunday, the first inning, he hits a 3-run homer to put the Cubs up over the Reds and kind of give them some breathing room. Rick Sutcliffe does the rest. You know the drill, right? Like, Cubs win, so they turn what could have been a terrible week into just, like, not a great week, right? By going 2-4. And he provided the leadership in that run. So I was doing a little research on Ron Say, because I remember Ron Say, the player and the name. He actually finished 17th in the MVP in 1984. Ryan Sandberg won the MVP, and several other Cubs were Rick Sutcliffe and Leon Durham were up there. So, he was like 4th or 5th on the team, but still, got some votes in the MVP, which was, I thought, impressive. But I was looking at his lifetime numbers, and, I remember him later in life as a Cub where he wasn't what I would call a defensive gold glover by any stretch. But, he had been a decent defensive player at the Dodgers earlier in his career. He could actually dive for balls, which he had stopped doing by this point in his Cubs career. But he also had 316 lifetime home runs, which in that era was actually a lot, before the modern sort of juiced era of home runs. He had over 1,100 runs batted in. His on-base plus slugging percentage was .799, which translated into an OPS plus, if you modernized it for today and ballparks, of 121, which is certainly significantly above average. Under the JAWS sort of system for ranking people, he's the 26th best third baseman of all time. Not bad. And in 1984, he had 25 homers and drove in 97 runs. In his 4 years as a Cub, actually, he hit like 115 home runs and was consistently driving in 97 runs. So, I think Ron Say is one of those guys who probably a little bit underrated, in the annals of history or forgotten about. His lifetime WAR was 53.7, which is significant. Like, he was that one home run that got called back earlier in April of this year away from being better than Tony Perez, for example, Hall of Famer. And in fact, his career WAR is higher than a lot of Hall of Famers, people who I think we would look at and say, oh, well, that guy's definitely a Hall of Famer. And yet, not as good as Ron Say in terms of things like WAR. Like, for example, he's just below David Ortiz on the list and Tony Perez, but he was above Fred McGriff.
Wow.
He was above Kirby Puckett, Ted Simmons, Orlando Cepeda, and of course, obviously, way, way, way above like the Harold Baines and people like that, right? So ahead of Yadier Molina, if he ever makes the Hall of Fame. So 53.7 is like, when you look at WARs, you're right in that sweet spot of a lot of Hall of Famers in and around you. So solid pickup for the Cubs. Sort of one of the pieces on a team that had a lot of good, strong players. Boy, wasn't it nice to have like a team where like 7 of your 8 everyday regulars before the DH are all like above average hitters. Not like we see now, but just like solid guys up and down the lineup. It really helps. And he picked up the team this week, got him to 2-4, which is unimpressive as that sounds. Kept him, 2.5 games ahead of the Mets in first place, and got him to live to fight another day next week. 1984 Cubs went 4-2, taking 2 out of 3 from Houston and 2 out of 3 from Atlanta. Now, the difference is they had a 3-game lead over the Mets in first place in the division, and to start the week, and they ended the week 5.5 games up. So the Mets started to slide, the Cubs did well, and this was sort of the beginning of the end for the rest of the National League East, as we used to call it back then, that the Cubs were in. A couple notes here. Rick Sutcliffe, again, doing what Rick Sutcliffe did that year. He won his 16th game on August 24th. He pitched 9 innings, gave up 5 hits, and no runs. We call that a complete game shutout, or we used to. I don't know what you call it. Now you'd call it like a miracle, I guess, but that's what we called it back then. And then the very next day, August 25th, I was able to attend the game. I got my ticket stub right here. So,
if you're watching on YouTube, you can see Pat's ticket stub.
don't remember much about it other than the ticket was for section 235, so that would have been the grandstands, $5 for a seat.
Show that ticket again to the camera.
Yeah, here we go. See that? So $5. Dirty little secret is you could usually get a little bit closer than your seat back in those days, but it was a Saturday, so it was probably crowded. And I got to go to the game that they lost that weekend, of course, my luck. Brad Kaminsky hit a 2-run homer for the Braves, and the Cubs lost every other run it was a 3-2 loss, and the other 3 runs scored in the game by both teams are all scored on outs. So it wasn't exactly the most memorable of games. Cubs scored their runs. I guess they scored 1 on a wild pitch and 1 on a ground out double play. So, not a lot to root for as a fan, but they came back the very next day when I was not there. Steve Trout pitching. He pitched a 9-inning game, gave up 8 hits and 0 runs to get his 12th win of the game. I'm trying to think of the last time a Major League Baseball team had 2 pitchers in one series pitch complete game shutouts. Like, it's probably been a while, I would think, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
And let me give you here's Trout's week overall, by the way. He pitched earlier in the week and on the 20th, and he went 9 innings, gave up 6 hits and 1 run. That 1 run he gave up was on a ground out double play, which, when the Cubs had a lead in the game, that's what you kind of want to do is get the 2 outs. So for the week, he pitched 18 innings, gave up 1 earned run, 14 hits, and got 2 wins.
Wow.
Don't see that very often either, do you? 2 complete games in 1 week.
That might be even rarer than the 2 teams. 2 shutouts by a team in 1 series. It's If you throw a complete game these days, they bubble wrap you for the next 2 weeks.
Right.
Extra rest, and you come out after 76 pitches the next time. And
I just wanted to highlight a few things about Steve Trout. Last week we talked a little bit about Ron Say. Steve Trout, by the way, in 1984, famously the son of Paul Dizzy Trout, who pitched for the Tigers against the Cubs in the 45 World Series. We heard a lot about that when the Cubs were in the World Series in 2016. And Steve Trout came to the Cubs in a trade in 1983 from the White Sox. That's back one of those rare crosstown trades where the Cubs would fleece the Sox yet again, just like they did with Sammy Sosa. The Cubs got not only Steve Trout, but Warren Brewstar, who pitched out of the bullpen moderately effectively in 1984. Trout had a career year that year, too. And the Cubs gave up, I swear I must have a baseball card with these guys on future prospects and their faces on there. Scott Fletcher, Randy Martz, and Pat Tabler, all future stars who were never stars. And also Dick Tidrow, Dirt, as we called him. Who was the setup man for Bruce Sutter, but Sutter was gone, and Lee Smith had taken over, and he had the Les Lancasters of the world. So no more need for Dick Tidrow. But the Cubs gave up 3 failed future stars, who I think by this point in time had pretty much been exposed as not people who you would expect much from. I do vaguely remember Randy Martz threw a palm ball. Have you ever heard of that? They don't do that anymore. But that was his claim to fame, the palm ball. I remember as a kid trying to reproduce a palm ball, probably about as effectively as Randy Martz did, frankly. But they weren't the best pitchers. Scott Fletcher and Pat Tabler were sort of, infielders who I think maybe Pat Tabler was the one who was really good with the bases loaded, but only with the bases loaded. So he had kind of a specialty, a skill set, if you will, but a narrow skill set. And the Cubs got Steve Trout out of it. And again, another Dallas Green pickup. I got to give him credit for that. And he was an instrumental part in the 1984 season, won 2 complete games this week. And I got to tell you, as we've gone through week by week and I'm looking at every box score, they were pitching the hell out of Lee Smith that year. I mean, he wasn't just pitching the 9th inning. He was coming into the 8th inning most of the time. So this guy was throwing a lot of innings. And it was nice to have a week where he had 3 complete games out of 6, right? Because it really did take the pressure off. And I don't think Lee Smith had to pitch at all this week. So it was kind of nice for him to have some time off. And the Cubs expanded their lead 5.5 games up headed into next week. So everything was looking good for the 1984 Cubs.
If you want to know more about Steve Trout, go to WrigleyvilleNation.com, our website. you click on all the podcast episodes in the past. You can go to August 8th, 2016, Wrigleyville Nation Podcast, episode 104, where we sat down and had a conversation and a long interview with Steve Trout. So highly recommend that. If you haven't heard it, go back. It's in the archives. It's for free right now. You can listen to episode 104, our interview with Steve Trout.
I have subsequently sat in the bleachers with Steve Trout for a baseball game.
But they were 6-1, so they had a great week. They swept Cincinnati, including a doubleheader sweep after a rainout, which I haven't gone back and done the math, but the Cubs had a lot of doubleheader sweeps in 1984.
Yes.
That is not something that's easy to do. Typically, if you look at the stats historically, doubleheader sweeps have been rare. But the Cubs did it against Cincinnati, and then they played, and then they had Atlanta came to town, and the Cubs won 3 out of 4 against Atlanta. We had another great start from Rick Sutcliffe, 8 innings, 5 hits, 7 strikeouts, 2 runs, and got another win, which he was doing pretty much every week we've talked about now. It's almost like he could win an award for this. And Ryan Sandberg had a nice game with a home run. The thing that I wanted to kind of highlight today is the Cubs brought up a guy from the minors who either pinch hit or started in every game this week, and was sort of a new addition to the team. And the reason I brought him up is it's sort of like the Bethencourt situation where, when you have those seasons where things go well and the magical seasons, somebody kind of comes out of nowhere and gives you a boost, whether it's a Randall Simon or a Luis Salazar, or pick any of those Cubs seasons of the past where you're like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. Jim Edmonds, that somebody comes in and does really well. And so this year I wanted to focus on a guy by the name of Thad Bosley. Does that name ring a bell to you?
Sure does, yeah.
So Thad Bosley, who I have a picture of from 1984. I don't know if you can see it here, but he's in the middle right here.
I'll hold it up a little higher. Hold it up a little higher. There you go.
This is him at the airport when he was with the Iowa Cubs, traveling with Dan Roan and Billy Hatcher, 2 future major league players, but they were all in the minors at the time. This was the Down on the Farm report from earlier that year, and they talk a little bit about him in that. He finally makes it up to the majors, and he only has 112 plate appearances, but it's a sizable number. And the thing about him that I noticed in 1984 is, and I know baseball statisticians and sabermetrics people can debate this back and forth, but the concept of being a clutch hitter, like if somebody's a clutch hitter versus just not a clutch hitter, and that you can go back and look at stats to see how you do in high leverage situations and medium and low leverage. Well, Thad Bosley had a unique gift of doing well in high leverage situations. So in 1984, while he hit 296 and had a 793 OPS, which are fantastic as a bench player in their own right, in high leverage situations, he hit 450 with a 1.25 OPS, which you say, well, that's, small sample size, but, lucky for him, lucky for them. Well, not really, because he had a history and became sort of known for this the next couple of years. He's a fantastic pinch hitter. I think he led the league in pinch hits one year. In 1985, the following season, he had an expanded role. He had 202 plate appearances. So you're like a third of the season he played. And he hit 328 with a 902 OPS. His on-base percentage, on-base plus slugging percentage in high leverage situations that year was 1.024 also. So he was basically like a baseball Hall of Famer in high leverage situations. He'd come in and pinch hit and get hits all the time. So much so that in 202 plate appearances, he ended up putting up 2.3 WAR, which is pretty fantastic considering a lot of those were just pinch hit appearances. It wasn't like he got to play the field as much, right? You extrapolate that over a whole season, that's a WAR of like over 7 or 7.5, which for a Cub position player would be, virtually unheard of. So Thad Bosley, who had a great week this week, was somebody who kind of added that extra spark in the 84 team in a way that I think was notable and deserves some recognition. The last thing I'll say about the 1984 season is, Lee Smith was one hell of a workhorse. That guy came in and closed out games all the time. The number of innings he pitched back then, when you talk about closers now and who the closer is, in the 5-day stretch for the period that we just discussed, Lee Smith had a win and 3 saves. Like, that doesn't happen anymore. Like, people don't do that, right? And he pitched in the other game too, by the way. So they just brought him out every game, and sometimes for more than one inning. And he came through for him that week. And the Cubs leave the week up 5 games over the Mets, with only 4 weeks left in the season. 5-game lead seemed insurmountable.
Sometimes a team would play 2 games, Monday, Tuesday, and then another team would come into town Wednesday and Thursday, and then another team would come in town for the weekend. That's what happened in 1984. The Cubs swept the Phillies, because we had half their players by now, 2 games to none. Split 2 games with Montreal. This is again in Chicago, and then won 1 out of 3 from the Mets, which was a little bit underwhelming, but still ended up being a 4-3 week and left the Cubs 6 games up. Boy, 6 games seems like a lot, doesn't it?
It
sure
did,
does when you're trailing.
Yeah, and especially when they were battling the Mets for when they were within a game there.
I know. So yeah, the Mets really needed a sweep. They didn't get it. Cubs were in good shape. Now, one other thing I would note too is Rick Sutcliffe pitched 2 of these games, September 3rd and 8th. The Cubs won both games. He increased his record to 14-1 on the season with the Cubs after coming over from Cleveland. In the first game, he only pitched 8 innings, gave up 3 hits and a walk, struck out 15 though.
Jeez.
In the second game, he did pitch all 9 innings, gave up 4 hits, no walks, no runs, and struck out 12. So a 4-hit, 12K shutout with no walks seems pretty fair. And that was over the Mets, which was a big win. He always came up with the clutch wins, So again, I was telling you about how the Mets series, they won 1 out of 3 and they really needed to win at least 1 and the Mets needed to sweep. He was the stopper. There's a term we used to use called ace. He was an ace.
Yes.
Right. He's the guy who, when the Mets come to town, he's going to single-handedly take the mound, not give up the ball to anybody, and win the game by not giving up any runs and striking out half their batters. And he did. So that was very helpful. On the season, he pitched 9 innings 10 times.
Good God.
And pitched 8 or more, meaning either the 8th or got into the 9th, and then Lee Smith or somebody came in 7 more times. So 17 times that he came in he started games, you knew you were going to get at least 8 innings out of him. Can you imagine being a manager now knowing that you're going to get at least 8 innings out of your starter 17 times over the course of a season? It would revolutionize how you could use your bullpen because they'd be so rested from not having to pitch those days.
And a guy like that being available for you to add to your team.
Yeah, it only cost him near Hall of Famer Joe Carter, but they got him. So hey, it takes something. You give something to get something, right? But yeah, he was exactly what they needed that season. He was the ace, and he came through, and the Cubs are rolling. Had a good week last week. They were 4-2, including winning 2 out of 3 at home against the New York Mets, the arch rival New York Mets. And they finished the week 9.5 games ahead in first place. That's back in the days when you tried to actually have a dominant team and you didn't just try to thread the needle all the time, right? So the Cubs 9.5 games ahead. It was just your regular ho-hum. Rick Sutcliffe won his 14th game as a Cub, to go with his 1 loss.
We talked about his incredible week last week.
Yeah. And, they just, kept on trucking. Jody Davis beat the Mets with a grand slam in the first game the Cubs played against them. It was I just wanted to note, we've talked a little bit about Jody Davis in the past, but really a fan favorite. And Harry Carey used to come up with songs for him, and he was a 2-time All-Star. It felt like as a young kid, it felt like he was more than that because he was so well liked. But 1984 wasn't even his best season, actually, as a Cub, but he did hit 19 home runs and he did drive in 94 runs, which is more than any Cub's going to drive in this year. So, it was a pretty good year for him. He was an all-star. He was 10th in the MVP voting, just to show you, sort of how much respect the league and the writers had for him as a catcher as well as a hitter. He ended up with, in his Cubs career, just as a Cub, hitting 122 home runs, which I'd have to go back and look for Cubs catchers to see what the record is. I'm sure that it was set in the 1920s, but I think the modern day, if you look at like the post World War II era, I don't think Randy Hundley hit 122 homers as a Cub, and I don't think Contreras did, and I don't think, just off the top of my head, as I try to go through certainly Joe Girardi didn't, or Damon Berryhill, or Soto, or any of these other guys, because none of them were around long enough to do that. So I think that's a pretty impressive feat for him as a Cub, and so yeah, it was a great week. Cubs are, at this point, we're ready to pretty much, they hadn't clinched the division yet, but they were getting really close, and we're ready to kind of start resting some people, get ready for the playoffs. So yeah, great season for the Cubs. And in fact, I just checked, Randy Hundley did not hit 122 home runs as a Cub. He hit 80 in 10 years. So yeah, I think Jody Davis is our top power hitting catcher of the modern era. We saw today or yesterday, I think the stat came out that Nico Horner became the first Cub to steal 30 bases or more in consecutive seasons since 2000 and 2001, when Eric Young Sr. pulled off the feat. Remember that?
EY.
Yeah, EY did it. Well, what they didn't probably note is that in 1984, the Cubs had not one but two players who stole 30 or more bases, and both of these players did it in consecutive seasons. Ryan Sandberg did it from 82 to 86 all the way through, and Bobby Dernier, part of the Daily Double, did it in 84 and 85. So
friend of the show.
That's how much extra speed the Cubs had in those days.
Isn't Bobby Dernier like the greatest guy ever?
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, he is.
Speaking of the old days, in 1984, this past week, the Cubs did something they'd never done in team history. They surpassed the 2 million attendance mark for the first time ever. Now, of course, if they don't get 2.7 to 3 million, they have to like cut their best players.
Fire more scouts.
Fire more scouts. That was a big deal back then, getting 2 million fans, which, makes sense when you think about it, because the Cubs played a 3-game series against the Pirates this week in 1984 and drew under 13,000 total for the 3-game series in Pittsburgh, just to show you where things were. And that was only 5 years removed from We Are Family, I might add. That was not the Pirates of today. That was the Pirates of yesteryear. Here's one, though, that I also, a little bit note here that I thought was interesting. So the 84 Cubs, just to show not just the attendance and the impact it had on basically Wrigleyville as a neighborhood and a lot of the kind of the longer lasting things, but, with Harry Carey and the popularity of the Cubs, both on WGN radio as well as television, the Cubs went in 1983, they had 11 radio affiliates for WGN. By 1986, starting the 86 season, they had 69. That's
nice. An
increase of 58 more affiliates based on the 84-85 seasons. And 85 wasn't exactly anything to write home about, but this is the kind of the kickoff of the popularity, which is why it's hard to understate too much the impact of the 84 season on sort of modern Cubism, I guess.
It was so easy to get tickets in 1984 that I grew up near Rockford, and the Rockford Public Library, they had a promotion for kids where for like every 5 books you read, you got 2 tickets to Cub games. And my dad and I went to 7 games for free on that. I checked out a lot of books. The Cubs were 7-0 in those 7 games. So I take a lot of credit for the turnaround.
I should find my tickets from 1983, because as in grade school back then, my friend Chris and I in the summers would go and sit in the bleachers, unattended by adults, of course, because who cared? And I think they back then they had kids tickets in addition to adult tickets, different prices, right? So might have been maybe $3, or maybe it was $1.50 for us and $3 for adults. Whatever it was fairly cheap, and we would have just enough money to get a hot dog and a Coke. And then the goal was to scam somebody in the bleachers into buying us like ice cream or another hot dog or whatever, because, you know, they were drinking. They weren't rich, but, you know, it wasn't that expensive back then. And we were kids, and they're like, oh, look, there's a little kid. Give him something. That was a lot of fun back in those days. You can't really do that now. You need a $100 bill probably at best. And DCFS would arrest your parents after the first game, so it'd be a real mess.
Right, and then if somebody wouldn't take cash, it would just complicate it even more.
Right. As my 13-year-old daughter was complaining at a Cubs game earlier this year when she was with one of her cousins, and she's like, "Yeah, it was really messed up. I had money, but I didn't have any credit card. So there's this machine where you can put the money in, and they give you a credit card." But then it's only worth as much as the money is, and then you can't use it. I'm like, yeah, that's how that works.
Yeah, but now you got a whole card full of Ricketts bucks. Congratulations!
Exactly. So, in 1984, this week the Cubs were not good. They were 2-4.
Yeah,
they got swept by Pittsburgh. They won 2 out of 3 against the Cardinals. But you know what? It didn't really matter, because even though they had a 5-game losing streak in late September, the Cubs are so far ahead of everybody, which is another way to do things. You know, no drama. You just keep winning. And they were still 6.5 games over going into the next week, with the magic number being 1 game. So they were fine. But the Sunday was especially nice because they had a rain out on Saturday. So they played the Cardinals twice on Sunday. There's nothing better than beating the Cardinals in a doubleheader on Sunday, where you get to go to both games for the price of one, because they don't clear the stadium and play the second game at 7 p.m. on a Sunday night. It's at noon, and then 30 minutes after the first game ends, the next game starts. And the Cubs made good work out of them, because the 2 starters that day were Eckersley and Trout. Eckersley went 7 innings in his game, gave up 2 runs, 6 hits, 4 strikeouts, no walks. Lee Smith came in, pitched 2 perfect innings. Cubs win. Second game, Steve Trout, not to be outdone, says, you know what? Bullpen, take the day off. I got this one. 9 inning, 1 run, 7 hits. And this is a stat that you would never see in modern era. Like, so a guy pitches 9 innings, right? Gives up 1 run, 7 hits, 1 strikeout, and 1 walk. That's it. Everybody was swinging. Yeah. Those are the days, right? And
Jordan Wicks is as close as you can get to that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I just laugh when people talk about, like, when we talk about the Hall of Fame, or we compare players of today's era versus the past. Like, you know, Andre Dawson didn't walk that much, so he's not as good a player. And I'm like, nobody told Andre Dawson to go walk. Like, no. They told him to get over there and swing the bat and hit the ball. Like, that's what they did back then. It was just that's the way it was, right? It's not like modern era. It's hard. I swear to God, if you asked any player from the 70s or 80s, like, well, why didn't you walk more? They'd be like, I was the cleanup hitter. Of course I don't walk. Yeah. I was there to hit the ball.
Yeah, or they were sitting there fouling off close pitch after close pitch that they probably could have taken for ball 4, trying to get a hit instead. You know?
Yeah. So anyway, so that was the week in 1984. Magic number is 1. The Cubs are on the precipice of doing something they had never done, which was win a division.
Excited to well, that's something to look forward to next week on our.
Let's hope they can come through and they don't blow the. It'd suck if the story ended with the Cubs losing all 6 games next week. That's all I can say.
Well, it's funny you said when they had that 5-game losing streak before they had swept the doubleheader and then won in Pittsburgh. Oh, I hope I didn't spoil it for anybody. The idea that there was no panic though. I mean, come on, it's Chicago. Right. This was, 15 years removed from the ultimate collapse. I guarantee you there were people who were, picking out a spot on a bridge to go just in case they needed it.
And with that...
And by the way, one last thing, and I don't want to spoil it for next week, but because the Cubs were going to Pittsburgh the following week to clinch, and this was such an epic historical thing for the Cubs, if this happened in the modern era, there'd be like 15,000 Cub fans who would drive to Pittsburgh, right, for this game. Spoiler alert, that did not happen.
No. And it's funny, when you watch the final out from both 84 and 89, because 89 very similar, they're in Montreal.
Yep.
You hear there's a noise that those big round, like all-purpose stadiums made when they were empty, like almost like this, like the weird, like I don't even know what it is.
The wind?
It's kind of a and you can hear it in both of them. Also, Harry somehow misses strike 3 both times. He's looking at it. Clearly, he's like, oh, it's like, Harry, come on. I think in the one in Pittsburgh, I think he had like 9 people in the booth with him. Like everybody was coming in. They were all half in the bag by then. But it's funny. He's
in the bag. That's generous.
Because in '84, it was still really good, Harry, like top of his game, announcer Harry. And he's still, when you listen to it, it's funny because it surprises him that it happened.
Well, it was a 4-2 week for the Cubs. They played at Pittsburgh for 3 games, then home for the Cardinals for 3. I think the most important game of that week happened on Monday, September 24th, when the Cubs played the Pirates in front of 5,000 fans. 5,472.
It's insane to think about.
Which was more than the 4,000 they got the next day and the 3,000 they got the day after. Because the Cubs' magic number was 1 at the time. And I promise you that if the Cubs were playing in Pittsburgh and the magic number was 1, you'd have 15,000 Cub fans going there now, right?
Absolutely.
Let alone 5,000 total. Rick Sutcliffe started for the Cubs. Rick Sutcliffe was victorious. He got his 20th win of the year. His 16th as a Cub. He was 16-1 as a Cub after the trade from Cleveland. 9 innings, 2 hits, 1 run, no walks, 9 strikeouts. Just another awesome game by Rick Sutcliffe that year. Struck out the last batter, pitched the complete game, of course. He wasn't going to let anybody else get in the way of that. It was a 4-1 victory for the Cubs. It was a great way to mark what was the Cubs' first ever division championship. Because when they went to the divisions in the 60s, of course, the Cubs had not won any because they hadn't finished over 500 in 12 years, let alone won a division. So Cubs won. They went home. They played the Cardinals. They split the first 2 games. The Sunday game was kind of fun because it mattered not at all. Most the Cubs starters all started the game, but they were all taken out early. So it was all the backups in the game. Cubs were down 1-0, bottom of the 9th. And the Cardinals bring out Bruce Sutter, who at the time had 45 saves, which was leading the league, right? That was an enormous number of saves back in 1984. Had a 1.50 ERA. This was a season when, although Rick Sutcliffe won the Cy Young, Bruce Sutter finished 3rd in the Cy Young in the National League. And he finished 6th in the MVP. So he was a stud pitcher for the Cardinals. So what happens down 1-0? Well, the veritable onslaught of Cubs stars, starting with Henry Cotto, most famous for having punctured his eardrum with a Q-tip and going on the 60-day IL once when he was a Mariner, led off with a base hit. Dan Roan, who was the actual hero of the Sandberg game, he drove in the winning run in the Sandberg game, despite Sandberg's 2 home runs off of Sutter. He gets a base hit. And then previously discussed Thad Bosley comes in, pinch hitter extraordinaire. He gets a base hit, ties the game 1-1. Gary Woods, another sort of part-time Cub player of some lore, draws a walk. And then Keith Moreland, the only regular in the lineup at this point, Zonk, as we call him, former University of Texas linebacker, I think, comes up to the plate. He hits a ground ball to 3rd. Bases loaded. Nobody out. They throw to the catcher for the force out. Back to first base. Throw the ball away. And Thad Bosley scores from 2nd, and the Cubs win the game in a walk-off. So the Cubs finish with 96 wins on the season with a walk-off win in front of the home team in a packed crowd on a Sunday against the Cardinals, just for fun with our 3rd string. And the Cubs end up winning the division by 6.5. And after the game, I never forgot, Jim Fry had all the players come out of the dugout in the clubhouse, and they all walked around the perimeter of the ballpark, high-fiving and shaking hands and talking and signing autographs to all the fans all the way around the entire field, which was kind of cool because I'd never even experienced anything like winning. So this was really fun. So the Cubs finished today, would have been the 40-year anniversary of that walk-off win against Bruce Sutter and the dreaded St. Louis Cardinals. And the Cubs had been slotted to play, and we'll talk next week about this, the San Diego Padres. Cubs and Padres being the only 2 National League teams never to be in an NLCS until now. Because remember, back then you didn't have divisional series. You just 2 teams made the playoffs in the National League. They played each other, and one of them went to the World Series. So the last 2 teams in the National League to never win a division both win it in the same year. Cubs will be hosting Game 1 next week, and I can't wait to tell you what happens then.
Last we spoke, the Cubs had won the division, and they were going to the playoffs, Pat.
96 and 65, the Cubs won the National League East, taking on the San Diego Padres, winners of the National League West. The only two teams in the National League who had never won the divisional series before when they faced each other. Back in those days, the way the playoff system works, a lot of people think, oh, the Cubs didn't get the extra home game, even though they had the better record because of the lights. It's not actually the lights. It's the fact that the league would alternate every year who, the West or the East, who would get the extra home game. And this, of course, perfect Cub moment. The Cubs did not get the extra game, right? So the first two games were at Wrigley, and then the 3 games in San Diego. One little fun fact that I think people may not know is that, did you know that for the first 4 games of this series, the umpires were not there because they were on strike? Big Ten umpires officiated the games.
Wow.
I'm not kidding you.
How? Oh, God.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So imagine that. And it cost the Cubs a chance at the World Series. But I digress. Game 1, got home from school. Cubs are up. Listening like on the transistor radio and stuff and on the bus and like, I mean, the Cubs just blew them out 13-0. It was a windy day. Wind was blowing out, but so what? The Cubs crushed them. Bobby Dernier led off with a home run. It was like very Dexter Fowler Game 7 like against the Guardians, right? Gary Matthews had 2 home runs. Ron Say had a home run. And, of course, Rick Sutcliffe launched one out of the ballpark onto Sheffield Avenue in right field, while also pitching 7 innings, giving up 2 hits and no runs, 8 strikeouts, and recorded his then – I don't know, like 16th win in a row or 15th win in a row, I guess, if you count, from the season as 21st overall. Cubs cruised to a 13-0 victory. Ernie Banks was the honorary coach for the Cubs. So he not only threw out the first pitch, but got to sit on the bench in uniform, which was kind of nice for him. And then Cubs had 16 hits and 6 walks. That's 22 base runners. It was just a real fun game. Next day, a little bit closer, but still more of the same. The Cubs won 4-2 behind Steve Trout, who we talked a lot about. Steve Trout had some solid games that year. 8 1/3 innings, 5 hits, 2 runs, perfectly acceptable. Only 2 strikeouts. It's the 80s. Lee Smith comes in and saves the game. Gary Matthews gets his 5th RBI of the day. Say and Jody Davis have big hits. Dernier and Sandberg, as they did in the first game, just keep getting on base and scoring the whole game. It was a lot of fun. And the Cubs headed to San Diego up 2-0. This is the point at which my grandfather got me a T-shirt that said Chicago Cubs NL Champs, which I have somewhere in storage to this day. There was a lot of optimism, as you can imagine, with the Cubs headed to San Diego up 2-0 against a team that was clearly a weaker opponent. The Game 3 was kind of a disaster. Dennis Eckersley was pitching. Future Hall of Famer, my ass, right? That guy. Yeah, okay. So when he left, maybe. When he was when he was with Cleveland and Boston, maybe. But when he was the Cubs, he had a decent year in 1984 and 85, but not. He was not Hall of Fame quality. This game, he certainly was. He went 5 1/3, gave up 9 hits and 5 earned runs, and the Cubs lost the game 7-1. Just write it off. It's sort of like that Zambrano game against the Marlins when the Cubs were up 3-1. You're like, oh, good. Well, we'll just we got one
plenty
prior,
more shots. Plenty more shots.
Yeah. Game 4, interesting decision. The Cubs decided to go with Scott Sanderson. Now they could have gone with Rick Sutcliffe on 3 days rest, but they didn't. They went with Sanderson. And then they could have had Trout in Game 5 if they'd wanted to. This was a Jim Fry decision. It was I remember I was at a Notre Dame game with my dad. Bad timing, but we bought the tickets not realizing the Cubs were going to go to the playoffs. Then 6 months later, and it rained, it poured in South Bend. Notre Dame lost, and the Cubs lost 7-5. It was a game where the Cubs actually had a lead for much of the game. They were up 3-2 in the bottom of the fifth, and Jody Davis and Leon Durham had hit home runs for the Cubs. Then they fell down 5-3 in the eighth, but they came back and tied the game 5-5. And in the bottom of the ninth, sadly, and Scott Sanderson hadn't pitched particularly well, but bottom of the ninth, the Cubs brought in Lee Smith, who gives up a 2-run home run to stupid Steve Garvey, who's still around somehow.
Yeah.
Steve Garvey hadn't hit a home run since August 15th. And here we are on October 6th or whatever, and he's hitting a home run just in the nick of time to beat the Cubs 7-5.
It's about 3 weeks until I will spend just a little bit of time on a busy night. I will spend just a little bit of time watching Steve Garvey get his butt kicked for fun. About 3 weeks from now.
Sadly, at this time, we were in the car post game, Notre Dame game, listening to the game on the radio. Because back then the radio announcers were still the actual Cub announcers, right? It wasn't like, the national team. I think that's still the case now, right? Like
on radio, you have national or local option.
Yeah. So we obviously chose the local option, and needless to say, it was not a great conversation at the time. I think, was Lou Boudreau still in the booth? Gosh, I wonder. But back in those days, Harry Carey would do 3 innings on TV, then 3 on the radio. They would alternate. It was he and Milo Hamilton or whomever. And so it was depressing. But it all set up for Game 5, which was October 7th, the day before my birthday, Jeremy. It's a Sunday. I remember that because we started off the day watching Walter Payton break the all-time rushing record. Woohoo! Big day for Chicago. Mm-hmm. And during the NFL pregame, Jimmy the Greek picked the Cubs to win Game 5 of the World Series. He said, it's Sutcliffe we trust, or something to that effect. And Sutcliffe had earned the trust over the years. So the Cubs actually got out to a 3-0 lead. And then the Padres scored a couple runs, so it was 3-2. And it was the 7th inning. And Sutcliffe was still on the mound. He had been faltering a little bit, but he'd thrown a lot of innings. All those shutouts in 9 and 8 inning games he pitched, the last half of the year might have been wearing on him. Guy gets on base, sack bunt over to second, ground ball to Leon Durham, who famously misses the ball, goes under his legs. The tying run scores to make it 3-3. There's the story about how Sandberg had accidentally knocked over some like juice or Gatorade onto his glove before the inning or whatever, and had to switch gloves or something. I don't know. Who knows? Fry left Sutcliffe in the game, and he gave up a single, and then Tony Gwynn was up, leaves him in the game to face Tony Gwynn, tough hitter for a right-handed pitcher. For any pitcher, really. He gets a double, drives in 2 runs, so the Cubs are now down, and then leaves him in the game, and Steve Garvey, decrepit old Steve Garvey, former Dodger, gets an RBI, and the Cubs are now down and stay down by 3 runs, and it was like 6-3 was the final. It was a real, even to this day, you wonder like why Fry left him. And then he brought in Steve Trout, and the Cubs didn't give up any more runs that inning, or... Yeah.
And even by like 15 years later, that would have been unthinkable. I mean, you wouldn't have your ace on the mound with a lead in the 8th inning, but the very dangerous heart of the opposing order coming up in an elimination game.
Never.
If it was, say, Mark Pryor, and you would go to your bullpen in that case, surely, and not make the same error. So, yeah, it's just one of those things. Unfortunately, 1984 was too early, but
today the anniversary of that Bartman game, by the way? It might be.
Yeah, it is.
I was there for that one too. I catch all the good ones. Yeah, because Facebook reminded me. There's a picture of me and the guys taken right before the 8th inning, just for fun, on a camera, which was hard to come by in those days. So the Cubs lost. The Padres went on to the World Series and got completely destroyed by the Detroit Tigers. There was a possibility of that rematch this year, but they both lost, so did not happen. And I kept some grudges on that Padres team. They became my most hated players as a kid, and whenever they would have an ill-fated demise or play poorly or get cut, I crossed them off my list. I had a list of all their names.
That damn Tony Gwynn was so likable, but you know who never gave you that kind of a problem was Steve Garvey.
Yes, Steve Garvey or Eric Shaw.
Right to this day, easy to root against.
Yes. Eric Shaw was the pitcher on the Padres who got lit up by the Cubs on the first game, but who later would have the confrontation with Andre Dawson, which would be very memorable in 1987. We've talked about before, but it was talk about bittersweet. The Cubs came within one game of the World Series. They had 3 chances to do it. It is the Cubs ended up having, I think, in my lifetime, 6 such opportunities to put away a team and to go to the World Series, and they were 0 for 6 until 2016, which is one of the reasons why I have so much respect for the likes of Kyle Hendricks and the other Cubs players on that team who were able to come back and win that series, especially Kyle Hendricks in Game 7. And so it was a sad day. I refused to eat cake or open my gifts because I was too upset. It was a late afternoon game. It didn't end until like 6:30 at night or something, And I went in my room and shut the door and would not come out. Happy birthday.
I think, and I'm too young to have been around for any of this, but I think people need to remember that this was a team that the Cubs had not even played in the postseason, which had only been expanded
in my lifetime.
The World Series for 15 years at that point.
In my dad's lifetime. Sorry.
Yeah. The Cubs hadn't seen the postseason in 39 years. They had no training. Their fans had no real concept for how to it was such an incredible summer. This team basically came out of nowhere. No one expected them to be that good.
Yeah.
They were that good. They were clearly the best team in the National League. And then to lose 3 straight when you just could have put them away with 1. And you had opportunities to win 2 of those games. It's just.
I hadn't in my conscious lifetime ever seen a Cubs team finish over 500. So it had been a rough 12 years of before that game. I mean, it was, you're right. The Cubs were always losers. They came back, they were great. And they came so close. Now, had they won that game and gone to the World Series with some of the mystique of the sort of the chance to go to the World Series dissipated at that point, probably, right? So I guess it made 2016 all the more special. Let's look at the bright side. I mean, everyone I think listening to this podcast was probably alive in 2016, unlike the 84 team.
The reason you guys are spent so much loving time recapping this team all year and why it was one of my favorite segments every week is that I'm not sure how many single seasons in any team's history that didn't include a championship were as pivotal, as definitive, as sort of shaping for the fan culture and everything the team is, as 1984 was.
For better, frankly, and other things, in terms of like, it really helped propel the Cubs into the modern era in a lot of ways. And Dallas Green was trying to do that with the organization, but it really, some of the improvements they started making with the ballpark, and ultimately they ended up getting lights, after this, but whether that's an improvement or not, I guess, probably in the grand scheme of things, at least for concerts. But no, it was a seminal moment and one that I guess I'll always remember. And I never quite have looked at the Padres the same way since, and certainly not Steve Garvey. Good God. Sorry it ended on such a tough note. I hope people knew ahead of time that's what was going to happen, because I hate to have. It's one of those shows where after the 5th season, like your favorite characters die, like at the end. Like, I don't know.
This to that point though, can you imagine being a big enough Cubs fan to tune into this podcast with any regularity and not already knowing? You can't. So that it was 40 years ago and everyone knew that this is how it ended, even if
had the Cubs won the World Series in 84, I truly believe they would have become the 85 Bears, in the sense that they had some characters on the team. Like like Ryan Sandberg, great guy, right? Mm-hmm. Gary Matthews, Rick Sutcliffe, Bobby Dernier, these guys, I still see them around, at various events and in the neighborhood and stuff, having lunch and stuff at various times. And just a bunch of guys who were good guys. I mean, and we've talked about some of the role players that were on that team too. That I think deserve attention and credit. And it's just Tim Stoddard and people like that. Lee Smith. Lee Smith, by the way, had open heart surgery a couple months ago. I just found that out the other day. It's like, I hope he's recovering well. But it was a good group of guys, and it would have been a real fairy tale story. Instead, we had to wait 32 more years, but we did get there.
Matt, you so eloquently summarized the importance of the 1984 team. Thank you for that. Pat, thank you for all the hard work you did in putting together these segments every single week throughout the season.